book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Proof of Conspiracy, How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy by Seth Abramson. This is from the introduction. In late 2015, after Donald Trump has formally announced his candidacy for president, a geopolitical conspiracy emerges overseas, whose key participants are the leaders of Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. These 6 men decide that Trump is the antidote to their ills. For Russia, U.S. sanctions. For Israel, the lack of Arab allies. For Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, perceived threats emanating from Iran. The conspirators commit themselves to doing whatever is necessary to ensure that Donald Trump is elected. Trump's presidential campaign is aware of and benefits from this conspiracy both before and after the 2016 election. On March 19, 2018, British journalist David Hurst, the former chief foreign leader writer for The Guardian, publishes the most important report of his career. Hurst, at one time the Moscow bureau chief at The Guardian, is now editor-in-chief of his own publishing venture, a London-based Middle East watchdog called the Middle East Eye. In the spring of 2018, he reports the existence of a years-long, continent-spanning conspiracy that will eventually envelop the President of the United States, the Red Sea Conspiracy. This book denominates the conspiracy Hurst uncovers as the Red Sea Conspiracy for the simple reason that it is hatched on a yacht in the middle of the Red Sea, a seawater inlet of the Indian Ocean bordered by, among other countries, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. One imagines that in his many years as a correspondent and commentator for The Scotsman, The Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, El Arabi, Al Jaid, TRT World, which is Turkish, Masr al-Aghan, Egypt, and The Guardian, Hurst never thought he'd stumble on a story as far-reaching in its implications as the Red Sea Conspiracy. But he did, and what he found could change the course of history. This book chronicles the events around the globe that preceded and followed the fall 2015 origin of the conspiracy, with a special focus on how the conspiracy prompted Donald Trump and his aides, allies, and associates to covertly collude with 6 countries, both before and after the 2016 presidential election: Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Bahrain, and Egypt. Events that began on the Red Sea in 2015 now influence President Trump's foreign policy toward all of these countries, toward other countries not involved in the conspiracy, such as Qatar and Iran, and more broadly toward Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The story of the Red Sea Conspiracy begins with a man named George Nader. As reported by Hurst in the Middle East Eye, toward the end of 2015, Nader, then an advisor to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known as MBZ, convened, with his patron's permission, a summit of some of the Middle East's most powerful leaders. Gathered on a boat in the Red Sea in the fall of 2015 were Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who would shortly become the heir apparent to the throne of the Saudi kingdom; MZB himself, by 2015 the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates; Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the president of Egypt; Prince Salman bin Hamad, the Crown Prince of Bahrain; and King Abdullah II of Jordan. Nader, the improbable maestro of these rulers' clandestine get-together, intended the plan he posed to the men to include the nation of Libya, but no representative from that nation attended the gathering. Of the leaders aboard the yacht, 2, MBS and MBZ, are already close. According to a New Yorker interview with Richard A. Clarke, a counterterrorism advisor to Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, MBS and MBZ, quote, talk on the phone all day to each other, end quote. The Red Sea meeting, although technically convened by Nader, is a means for MBZ to advance ambitions that he and MBS have designed together. The 2 Sunni Arab leaders' intention, Hurst records, is to remake the Middle East with the covert assistance of a highly placed American politician. They intend to do this by first renaming and reconstituting the membership of the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which in 2015 comprises Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, while reorienting, too, its regional ambitions and global alliances. The proposed GCC realignment would evict Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar from the Council and replace these three countries with Egypt, Jordan, and Libya, thereby eliminating the entity's historical association with the Persian Gulf and remaking it as, instead, an alliance constituting, quote, an elite regional group of 6 countries which would supplant the GCC and form the nucleus of a coalition of pro-U.S. and pro-Israeli states in the Middle East, end quote. According to 2 sources briefed on the 2015 Red Sea Summit, quote, Nader said this group of states could become a force in the region that the United States government could depend on to counter the influence of Turkey and Iran, end quote. Prior to 2015, Turkey and Saudi Arabia had intermittently enjoyed strong diplomatic ties. The book Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Wednesday greetings, and it's Yom Kippur. In our second hour of our program today, Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, will be with us for a full hour taking your calls. Often he's in this hour, but Middays with Mark will be in our second hour. And in our third hour, Mark Karlin, founder and editor of BuzzFlash.com, is going to be here talking about the evidence now that Trump is destroying evidence. Pretty amazing stuff. As we speak right now, at this moment, American-made warplanes are dropping American-made munitions on Kurdish civilians in northern Syria, and a bloodbath has apparently begun as a result of Donald Trump. I mean, this all, according to the news reports, the way this all started was that Mr. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, or now you could say dictator, now that he's taken on all these powers to himself, was so angry with Trump that he didn't have a one-on-one meeting at the UN, that he called up and started berating Trump. Trump apologized and groveled and offered him a visit to the White House, and Erdogan said, that's not enough. I want to be able to get those terrorists out of northern Syria and southern Turkey. And of course, by terrorists, he's referring to the Kurds. And so Trump greenlit this invasion, which is happening right now. And the official word is that U.S. forces have been told to stand down, allow the slaughter to proceed. On the line with us is Dr. Edmund Ghareeb. He's the adjunct professor of Middle Eastern history and politics at the School of International Service at American University. He was the first Mustafa Baranzi Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies at the Center for Global Peace at American University, and a professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. His books include The Historical Dictionary of Iraq, The Kurdish Question in Iraq, and The Kurdish Nationalist Movement and the War in the Gulf, which he co-authored with Majid Kaduri. Dr. Ghareeb, welcome back to the program. It's been quite some time since we've talked. I'm so glad you were able to join us this morning. Dr. Ghareeb? He's got his earbuds in and everything, but he doesn't appear to be hearing me. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, turn on Skype audio. Dr. Ghareeb, can you hear me? Dr. Ghareeb? Dr. Ghareeb. Okay, we're gonna set that aside for a moment, and I'm gonna let Joyce and Nate work this out, and we'll figure this out. We'll get Dr. Ghareeb on in a few minutes, in fact, he's dropped off the telephone line here, and I want to get into some of the other things that are going on. But this slaughter of the Kurds is, I think, the number one story. The number two story is America ready for a lawless president? I mean, this is what we have now, is a president who has asserted in federal court now, in two different cases and situations, one involving his taxes and the other involving the grand jury testimony that was incorporated into the Mueller report and that formed the foundation for the Mueller report. In both cases, he said he can't be investigated, he doesn't have to turn things over, he doesn't have an obligation to Congress, etc. And I'd like to point out that Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, whose picture hangs next to Trump's desk in the Oval Office, the slave owner, arguably one of our worst presidents, Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court twice. When Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court said, you may not relocate the Cherokees to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, and slaughter thousands of them in the process, he said basically, Supreme Court Justice Marshall has made his ruling, let him enforce it. And is Dr. Ghareeb on the phone now? Can we make this work? Okay, Dr. Ghareeb, can you hear me? Yes, sir, I can. Thank you so much for joining us.
How are you?
I am well, and I don't think you heard my introduction, but I went through a long introduction of you and mentioned that it's been a while since we've talked. I'm so glad to have you back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you. I set this up by suggesting that, on this phone call, apparently Erdogan felt snubbed by Trump at the UN and so called him up and berated him. Trump offered him a visit to the White House. That wasn't enough. He said he wants to clear out the terrorists in southern Turkey and northern Syria, that being code for the Kurds. Now, and you've written several books on the history of the Kurds. Is that a reasonably accurate description of what's going on? I'm assuming that, in fact, Erdogan was using being snubbed at the UN as an excuse to demand this because it appears he had his military all ready to go, and that it's American munitions, American planes that are right now dropping bombs on Kurdish civilians. Do I have all that right, sir?
Yes, I think to a large extent that's true. We still don't know exactly what happened in that conversation between Erdogan and Trump in New York, but the Turks at that time, however, had a different version than the version that we heard from the American side. From the American side, we heard that the president and the whole administration were on the same page, that the U.S. had agreed to the establishment of a secure zone or a secure area along the border between Turkey and Syria, while the Turks were saying, and on the other hand, that there was division within the U.S. administration. There was the president and some other officials who supported them, who agreed to this safe zone, but there were others opposed, and that ever they said there were still disagreements about the depth of that and the area of that secure zone. I mean, from what we understood at that time, that safe zone was supposed to be about somewhere between 5 and 7 kilometers deep and about 120 to 150 kilometers wide, while the Turks wanted 131 kilometers deep and about 200 to 300 kilometers wide. So, but basically that's what we understood until last Sunday, when the news came out after the conversation between the two presidents, that the U.S. was going to withdraw. It was not going to support neither the Turks nor the Kurds, and withdraw from that area. Now, how far has the U.S. withdrawn? It's not yet clear. Has the U.S. withdrawn from the whole area? That's not obvious as of now, but
we're getting reports from NBC. Right, we're getting reports from NBC News that even the U.S. troops in the region, and there's only between 1,000 and 2,500 of them apparently, have been told to stand down. Specifically, we've got live reporting from there coming through NBC. Yes. You've been studying this stuff for years and years. You know these groups, you know these people. The obvious stuff to me, anyway, is just as an observer, is that Trump's betrayal of the Kurds is going to cause, this ethnic group that at one time was its own nation, to no longer trust the United States, and that the larger issue is that probably any of our allies, or many of our allies anyway, will now be concerned that they can't trust the United States, particularly if their enemy is a country where there is a Trump Tower. And my imagination was that Erdogan called up Trump and said, you're making $5 million a year off this Trump Tower and licensing fees in Istanbul. I'm going to pull the plug on it. I don't know if that's the case or not, but knowing how Trump thinks, but that people won't trust America anymore. A, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes,
not about the Trump Tower.
I would agree.
And B,
with,
how much farther does it go beyond that?
I think for the points that you have made, particularly this issue of trust, is extremely important. I think U.S. credibility is on the line. Basically, the Kurds, yes, the U.S., when you talk to U.S. officials, they say, we did not make any commitments to the Kurds that we would defend them against Turkey, but at the same time, we know that that's what the Kurds expected. We know that also the U.S. government provided weapons and material, as well as there was a budget to support Syrian Democratic Forces, which are led by the Kurds, but they include some Christian forces, they include some Arab forces, Muslim forces. So that we know that part of it is true, and that's actually what the Pentagon announced as late as yesterday. Nevertheless, I think the Kurds expected that. They fought alongside the U.S. They helped the U.S. against ISIS, and so now they were left to hang, dry in a way, as some of them were really disappointed. I was speaking with some Kurdish representatives of the Syrian Democratic Forces yesterday, and they were very much disappointed. They were shocked. That on one hand. On the other hand, it should not have come really as a total surprise. President Trump, as a candidate, said that he was going to withdraw from what he called these endless wars. At the same time, he said that after he reached the White House. Last December, he announced he was going to withdraw from Syria, and what the reaction we saw is that the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, resigned at that time. And later on, more recently, we have seen the pushing aside of Bolton, who has been a hawk on a variety of issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Korea, whether it's Syria. Also, about a week ago, there was an article which was published in more than one newspaper, which quoted a senior U.S. official who said that there is a storm brewing in that part of the world. This is a full storm, he said, and we may be forced to withdraw. So basically, this should not have come totally as a surprise to the Kurds in terms of the recent developments. And also, as we had talked more than once, we had spoken about what
Dr.
Ghareeb,
with the Kurds in Iraq. Forgive the interruption, Dr. Ghareeb, but we're hitting a hard break here. I can't control it. Can you stick around and continue speaking with me? Great. Thank you very much. We're talking with Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, adjunct professor of Middle East history and politics at the School of International Service at American University. He's also the author of numerous books, including the Historical Dictionary of Iraq, the Kurdish Question in Iraq, and the Kurdish Nationalist Movement.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with our conversation with Dr. Edmund Ghareeb in just a moment. So, Dr. Ghareeb, I'm sorry, we got interrupted by that break. There'll be another one in 4 minutes. And then we can continue the conversation to the bottom of the hour if you're available.
Oh, no problem.
Oh, great. So you were saying.
That's, by the way, it's been 3 decades, so it's been a long time.
Yeah. So you were saying when we hit the break, you were about to make a point.
Basically, also the Kurds, and we have you about this. The Kurds had as pawns, unfortunately, on more than one occasion by various superpowers, including the United States. Probably some allies relied on the Kurds, and then they would drop them like a hot potato almost. We know, for example, the first Kurdish republic that was established in 1946-47. That republic was supported by the Soviet Union at the time. However, it was very much opposed by the Shah of Iran, and the U.S. and Britain supported the Iranian government at that time to suppress that republic. That republic collapsed. Its leader was executed along with a large number of his advisors and followers. With probably the best-known example is what happened in the 70s when the U.S. launched a covert operation to help the Kurds of Iraq. The purpose was really to undermine the Iraqi government, although the Kurds were not told that. And when the Shah, and it was also done to support the Shah at that time, who had been facing a serious conflict with Baghdad. So in 1975, the Shah and Saddam Hussein reached an agreement to solve their border disputes, to solve some of their political disputes, and the Kurds were dropped again. And when Secretary Kissinger, he was at that time working for the Ford administration, was asked about this, how could you drop the Kurds, how could the U.S. drop Kurdish allies, said that covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Basically, also one time he said, we are not in the charity business. So basically this happened again, and it happened again and again in the 80s and the 90s. In the 2003, the Kurds had hoped that they might gain independence in Iraq, and they were counting on the U.S., and that didn't happen. And then we saw also in Afrin, when Turkey invaded about a year or so ago, the region of Syria known as Afrin, mostly inhabited at that time by Kurds, and the U.S. did nothing. So basically, the Kurdish leadership in Syria should have at least taken that into this long history into account.
Well, I'm guessing that they did. They had to be aware of this. But they have no other. I mean, they don't have their own nation any longer. They've got no place to turn. So aren't they just kind of grasping at straws? We have about 20 seconds till we hit this break.
Yes, very much. That's the problem. However, there was now something that they made called the government in Damascus. When they could have done that from a stronger position, when they were in a position of strength, that would have maybe would have been a better opportunity for them.
Dr. Ghareeb, I have one more question for you. If you could stick around just a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Edmund Ghareeb is with us from Washington, D.C. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, adjunct professor of Middle East history and politics at the School of International Service at American University, and the author of numerous books on this region and specifically on the Kurds. And Dr. Ghareeb, we have, I think we've got about 3 minutes here until we're going to hit a break at the bottom of the hour and have to end the conversation. How do you think? And we were just talking during the last break about how frequently and cynically, basically, in the case of Henry Kissinger, the United States has repeatedly betrayed the Kurds, as have other regional powers, as did the Soviet Union, as did the Brits, and yet they have no place to turn. They don't have their own country. and they're scattered kind of among Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. How do you think that this invasion by Turkey, this slaughter of the Kurds that is beginning right now as we speak, how is that going to realign the region? What are the near term and what are the worst possible outcomes of this event?
The worst possible outcome would be to continue to destabilize this area, to continue to destabilize Syria, to continue with the fighting among the different factions, among the various ethnic groups and all, but also between radical Islamic groups and other groups inside Syria. This is like it could easily spread to other areas. It has, in fact, spread to other areas.
In other words, this could re-energize and re-metastasize ISIS?
It has actually ISIS. This is a great question that you asked. I'm glad you asked it. Primarily, there's something, a mindset in the U.S., or particularly in Washington, who think only of the immediate issues. But it was, in fact, the interventions in Iraq, the disastrous interventions in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, which were extremely costly in terms of lives and in terms of material, not only for the people of that region who were really devastated. Cities were destroyed, the infrastructure was destroyed totally, and it led to instability. At the same time, the U.S. It cost the U.S. somewhere between $8 and $10 trillion, which could have been better spent inside the United States, and yet nobody seems to have learned a lesson from this, that these interventions have also devastating results and consequences. So basically, I think if there is a chance now maybe to try to get the Syrian people, the opposition, as well as the government together, sit down and push to try to reach an arrangement and to stop the interventions from outside, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, whether it's the European powers, or whoever, or the U.S., or anyone else. I think what the foreign powers could do is to try, maybe if they really want to help the Syrian people reach agreement and political agreement, and then to help the country rebuild.
We have just a half a minute left. Is it possible that this could be the spark, like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in the early 20th century, that leads to a larger regional war and perhaps even a world war?
It could. Still, I would say, hopefully, highly unlikely that there would still be some wise leaders who would avoid that. But the danger is there.
Yeah, remarkable. Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, his most recent book, or his books include the Historical Dictionary of Iraq, The Kurdish Question in Iraq, The Kurdish Nationalist Movement and the War in the Gulf, among others. Professor of Middle East History at the School of International Service at American University. Dr. Ghareeb, thank you so much for dropping by today.
Thank you very much, Tom.
It's always great talking with you. I look forward to future conversations. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So how do you think this is going to play out? Do you have a unique perspective on this or understanding of it? I want to get into that. And I'm also going to talk a little more about America's lawless president.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Proof of Conspiracy, How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy by Seth Abramson. This is from the introduction. In late 2015, after Donald Trump has formally announced his candidacy for president, a geopolitical conspiracy emerges overseas, whose key participants are the leaders of Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. These 6 men decide that Trump is the antidote to their ills. For Russia, U.S. sanctions. For Israel, the lack of Arab allies. For Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, perceived threats emanating from Iran. The conspirators commit themselves to doing whatever is necessary to ensure that Donald Trump is elected. Trump's presidential campaign is aware of and benefits from this conspiracy both before and after the 2016 election. On March 19, 2018, British journalist David Hirst, the former chief foreign leader writer for The Guardian, publishes the most important report of his career. Hirst, at one time the Moscow bureau chief at The Guardian, is now editor-in-chief of his own publishing venture, a London-based Middle East watchdog called the Middle East Eye. In the spring of 2018, he reports the existence of a years-long, continent-spanning conspiracy that will eventually envelop the President of the United States, the Red Sea Conspiracy. This book denominates the conspiracy Hirst uncovers as the Red Sea Conspiracy for the simple reason that it is hatched on a yacht in the middle of the Red Sea, a seawater inlet of the Indian Ocean bordered by, among other countries, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. One imagines that in his many years as a correspondent and commentator for The Scotsman, The Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, El Arabi, El Jaid, TRT World, which is Turkish, Masr al-Aghan, Egypt, and The Guardian, Hirst never thought he'd stumble on a story as far-reaching in its implications as the Red Sea Conspiracy. But he did, and what he found could change the course of history. This book chronicles the events around the globe that preceded and followed the fall 2015 origin of the conspiracy, with a special focus on how the conspiracy prompted Donald Trump and his aides, allies, and associates to covertly collude with 6 countries, both before and after the 2016 presidential election: Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Bahrain, and Egypt. Events that began on the Red Sea in 2015 now influence President Trump's foreign policy toward all of these countries, toward other countries not involved in the conspiracy, such as Qatar and Iran, and more broadly toward Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The story of the Red Sea Conspiracy begins with a man named George Nader. As reported by Hirst in the Middle East Eye, toward the end of 2015, Nader, then an advisor to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known as MBZ, convened, with his patron's permission, a summit of some of the Middle East's most powerful leaders. Gathered on a boat in the Red Sea in the fall of 2015 were Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who would shortly become the heir apparent to the throne of the Saudi Kingdom; MZB himself, by 2015 the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates; Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the president of Egypt; Prince Salman bin Hamad, the Crown Prince of Bahrain; and King Abdullah II of Jordan. Nader, the improbable maestro of these rulers' clandestine get-together, intended the plan he posed to the men to include the nation of Libya, but no representative from that nation attended the gathering. Of the leaders aboard the yacht, 2, MBS and MBZ, are already close. According to a New Yorker interview with Richard A. Clarke, a counterterrorism advisor to Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, MBS and MBZ, quote, talk on the phone all day to each other, end quote. The Red Sea meeting, although technically convened by Nader, is a means for MBZ to advance ambitions that he and MBS have designed together. The 2 Sunni Arab leaders' intention, Hirst records, is to remake the Middle East with the covert assistance of a highly placed American politician. They intend to do this by first renaming and reconstituting the membership of the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which in 2015 comprises Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, while reorienting, too, its regional ambitions and global alliances. The proposed GCC realignment would evict Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar from the Council and replace these 3 countries with Egypt, Jordan, and Libya, thereby eliminating the entity's historical association with the Persian Gulf and remaking it as, instead, an alliance constituting, quote, an elite regional group of 6 countries which would supplant the GCC and form the nucleus of a coalition of pro-U.S. and pro-Israeli states in the Middle East, end quote. According to 2 sources briefed on the 2015 Red Sea Summit, quote, Nader said this group of states could become a force in the region that the United States government could depend on to counter the influence of Turkey and Iran, end quote. Prior to 2015, Turkey and Saudi Arabia had intermittently enjoyed strong diplomatic ties. The book Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. By the way, if you're in the Portland area, tomorrow night at Powell's at 7:30, that's Powell's City of Books, the downtown location on Burnside, I will be giving a rather lengthy talk. Well, I don't know, less than an hour, but anyhow, we're going to do a deep dive into my new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. And something I'm going to be getting into next week, too, on this program as well. And signing books. So, you know, if you're in Portland and you want to drop by and say hi, bring any of my other books with you, and I'd be glad to sign those too. So, two major things that I wanted to just bring up this hour and get your thoughts on it. Our number 202-808-9925. Just a reminder, in the next hour, Congressman Pocan will be with us for the hour taking calls, and then in our third hour, we're going to get back into some of the impeachment stuff with Mark Karlin. But one of the arguments. Well, first of all, just to close out on the Kurds. The Kurds have lived in this region, in this northern Syria, southern Turkey, northwestern Iraq, southwestern Iran, if I'm remembering my picture of the Middle East correctly. They've lived in this region for quite some time. They have, back when it was the Ottoman Empire, they were semi-autonomous. That all got carved up after World War I, and the Kurds got screwed. And they have fought on our side, and it wasn't, in the news they're talking about the Kurds fighting side by side with Americans. No, we've been providing air support, we've been providing weapons, we've been providing logistics, but our soldiers have not been fighting. Our soldiers did not fight ISIS. The Kurds lost between 10 and 15,000 people killed in action against ISIS. They captured more than 90,000 ISIS fighters who are now in 5 detention camps that they control. They did all this on our behalf, for us. Now, yeah, in part they were defending their own towns, their own areas, and that's what's so tragic about this. Erdogan doesn't like the Kurdish independence movement in the south of Turkey. The Kurds want to have their own country, or at least their own state, over which they have some autonomy. And Erdogan is like, no, sorry, ain't going to happen, and has labeled them terrorists. And now he's trying to take out the Kurds in northern Syria. This is a genocidal slaughter. It's nothing less than that, being aided and abetted by Donald Trump, in my opinion, because he's making money on a Trump hotel in Istanbul. I think that's the lens through which Trump is seeing all this stuff. Just like he wants to have a Trump hotel in Moscow, he's seeing that through that lens. You know, you'll recall when the first time he visited Kim Jong-un in North Korea, he talked about how, Pyongyang, and for that matter, the seacoast, he said there's this huge undeveloped seacoast in North Korea that could be turned into huge resorts, with Trump's name on them. I mean, it's all about Donald Trump making money. And so he betrays our allies. They're being slaughtered as we speak. American soldiers have been told to stand down. American-made jets are dropping American-made bombs on Kurdish civilians, on children, on men and women who never took up arms. It's beyond obscene. And I am very concerned that this could be the fuse that lights a larger regional war. I was glad to hear Dr. Ghareeb say that he thought that was a remote possibility, that this could be a World War I scenario. But I was concerned to hear him say it's not an impossibility. Particularly if Iran gets into this, if Russia gets into this, if NATO gets into this. Turkey is a NATO power. Where the hell is NATO in this? I mean, if we had an actual leader in Washington, D.C., somebody who paid attention to his briefing papers, somebody who made an effort to understand international geopolitics, rather than sitting on his phone tweeting constantly, rage tweeting about, impeachment and Democrats and Nancy Pelosi and all this kind of crap. We could have averted a slaughter and we could have, kept ISIS bottled up, essentially. And as I've said many times, I'm not a fan of the United States, military involvement anywhere. But this was not U.S. forces fighting. This was U.S. forces purely. We at the peak we had 2,600 soldiers in Syria. They've been drawn down to a little over 1,000 right now. And basically what they're providing is logistical support. And I realize, back in 1961, 62, John Kennedy said, oh, let's move 15,000 advisors into Vietnam. And we all know how that turned out. But we're already there. Bush and Cheney lied us into these wars, as Dr. Ghareeb pointed out, that have cost millions of lives, trillions of dollars, $8 to $10 trillion to the United States. We could have rebuilt we could have rebuilt every school in America, half the hospitals in America, much of the roadway in America, and we could have created a national rail system with $8 trillion. But instead, George Bush and Dick Cheney decided to lie us into a couple of wars where we just pissed this money away. And in the process created, radically amplified and strengthened al-Qaeda, and then created ISIS out of that. We did. This was the result of Republicans lying us into these wars. And now, meanwhile, you've got Donald Trump saying that he's not accountable to the Constitution. That the Democrats, they haven't held a vote in the House of Representatives, so we're going to ignore everything. Well, they're not even saying, he's not even now saying, if they have a vote, I'll cooperate. He's just saying, no, I'm not going to cooperate. We have, and so, what happens when you have a constitutional crisis like this? My understanding of this, and of course we'll ask Congressman Pocan when he comes on in the next hour, but my understanding of how this sort of thing typically plays out is when you have a dispute between the executive branch, the president, and his, in the Department of Justice and whatnot, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and in this case the House of Representatives, being led by Nancy Pelosi. When you have a dispute between those two branches of government, the agency, as it were, that adjudicates that dispute, that determines, who wins and who loses in that dispute, is the Supreme Court. And in fact, that's what happened in Nixon v. U.S. back in 1974. That's what happened in, was it Starr versus Clinton? I forget the exact name of the Supreme Court case, where Bill Clinton was sued. Maybe it was Jones v. Clinton by Paula Jones, which kind of started that whole thing, you'll recall. And the Supreme Court said, yes, he can be deposed in a civil lawsuit. And it was in that deposition where Monica Lewinsky was brought up, and he lied about it under oath, and that was what led to his impeachment. But the point is that, the court has intervened in these disputes between the legislative and executive branches twice with regard to impeachment. So let's say that the Democrats go to the Supreme Court and say, you need to tell Trump that he needs to turn over these documents and he needs to allow people who have worked for him to testify before Congress. If it has to do with top secret stuff, we can do it in secret session. But if not, it's going to be in public. You, Supreme Court, need to tell Trump and the executive branch to cooperate with an impeachment inquiry because it is mandated by the Constitution. Now, one of two things could happen. One would be that the Supreme Court, in a purely partisan move, in a 5-4 decision, would say, Trump doesn't have to do that. You haven't yet made a strong enough case. Or maybe even, we now disagree with the way that we ruled in the late 90s. I think it was 98 in Jones v. Clinton, and in 74 in U.S. v. Nixon. We now disagree with our, with our predecessors' decisions, They could do that. Or alternatively, they could say, okay, Trump, you got to turn this stuff over and you've got to send your people to testify before Congress. That's our ruling. Now, if the first thing happens, I'm not sure how this plays out. We already have a confession from Trump that he basically said to the president of Ukraine, you give me dirt on Joe Biden, I'll give you weapons to protect yourself against, Russia going beyond Crimea or beyond the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, where there's, a lot of apparently Russian occupation forces or irregulars anyway. So we've got that. I mean, arguably, he could be impeached right now with nothing more. So that would be one way that plays out. But the alternative, the thing that really concerns me, the one that I think we all really need to pay attention to, is if the Supreme Court says to Trump, you have to turn this stuff over, and Trump says no. What then? This has happened 3 times in our history. Twice with Andrew Jackson, once with Abraham Lincoln. In Lincoln's case, the Supreme Court in Dred Scott, Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1856, which was 4 years before Lincoln ran for president, 5 years before he was inaugurated. But nonetheless, in that decision, the Supreme Court said that people of African ancestry, regardless of what state that they were in, were property, not persons. And Abraham Lincoln, when he became president, he said, I'm going to ignore the Supreme Court. But more to the point here is what happened in Andrew Jackson's presidency. Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder. Andrew Jackson was a Southerner. Andrew Jackson is the guy whose picture hangs in Trump's office. Andrew Jackson was the guy who was going to be taken off the $20 bill and replaced by Harriet Tubman, as I recall. And Trump put a stop to that. It's supposed to happen last year, I think. Trump and Mnuchin. But Andrew Jackson most famously is the guy who, when the Supreme Court said, Jackson said, we're going to take all these Cherokees in Georgia and we're going to turn their land over to plantation owners and slaveholders who are going to turn this into plantations and grow cotton. We're going to kick out the Cherokees and we're going to march them all the way over to Oklahoma. When Andrew Jackson said he was going to do that, he got sued. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And there's not an actual document that actually quotes Jackson as saying this, but there are numerous people from the time who quoted him saying it, where he said, okay, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. And there is the problem. The Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism outside of the executive branch. The executive branch is where all the police powers reside. And the one thing that has prevented the executive branch from rising up, that is the president, from a president in the past, from rising up and becoming a dictator, has been, frankly, goodwill, a belief in the American Republic. Back when Franklin Roosevelt was pushing through legislation for his New Deal, he did a few things by executive order, and Republicans were saying, oh my God, he's turning into a dictator. Well, he didn't. He respected the rule of law. The same thing was said about, Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society. The same thing was said, frankly, about George W. Bush and Dick Cheney with their illegal wars and their torture and stuff. But they didn't go so far, arguably, they didn't go so far as to say to Congress, no, you can't have this. Although, the CIA, which is part of the executive branch, did destroy all those videotapes of the torture that the U.S. engaged in that was sanctioned within the Bush White House by Jay Bybee, by John Yoo, and by Brett Kavanaugh, the lawyers who were working for George W. Bush at that time. But if Donald Trump says, no, I'm not going to do what the Supreme Court tells me to do, period, full stop, nya, go ahead and make me, I dare you. If he does that, if he says that, then we've walked off the edge of the cliff for the first time in our history. Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court didn't have to do with impeachment, didn't have to do with high crimes and misdemeanors. It had to do with relatively small things. The first was the Trail of Tears. The second was the Second National Bank. The Supreme Court said you can't shut the bank down. Jackson went ahead and did it anyway. But these were not things that shook the nation.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
But if Trump pulls an Andrew Jackson here, and I'm fully expecting he will, we have to prepare for, a serious constitutional crisis. And welcome back. Amazing. Amir in West Hills, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, Amir, what's up?
Hello, yes. Speaking of basically crises, you were just talking about constitutional crisis, but we do have a global crisis that you addressed during the first part of the program with Edmund Ghareeb and his informative basically visiting the history of betrayals, primarily coming from basically the West. Of course, the first one, 1945, could be retraced to, as Dr. Ghareeb said, to the former Soviet Union, but an American basically who visited that republic found that it was really more an American-style democracy, and that the United States should really have defended that republic, 1945.
Right, this is the Kurds. The Kurds were trying to emulate the United States and having a democratic republic. You're absolutely right, Amir.
And this is exactly, after from 1945 to present time, what I want to stress, the Kurdish movement has gone through transformation. It is not really the kind of narrow nationalism to be obsessed with its own realization of basically some of the basic linguistic, cultural rights that to this day it is deprived of. It has become a transnational basically movement. It is aligned with progressive movements for a secular democracy. And this is what is to be highlighted. And unfortunately, when it comes to Rojava, Western Syria, this aspect of the Kurdish movement has not received the well-deserved attention, so that global forces are mobilized to defend. There have been quite a few Western volunteers who have even given their lives to safeguard this democracy. But unfortunately, the West has not been responsive in the same way that the Kurds have been responsive to a global need for global mobilization against the retrograde and the dark ideology of the Islamic State. And they entered the global really front, and they succeeded. They spearheaded the whole movement, the global movement. But unfortunately, what I wanted to highlight is this, global world community has not come to help them during this time of basically desperation. And it is this transnational aspect of the Kurdish movement during the contemporary times that I wanted to highlight, and perhaps that was something which Dr. Ghareeb brought up in the global dimensions of the crisis if basically nothing is done to stop it or to intervene more effectively politically.
I'm wondering why I'm not hearing boo out of the European countries. Do you have any insight into that?
Unfortunately, they look to the United States.
Yeah.
Still, the big brother is not too far away, is around the corner. And that must be, the primary reason. And they compromise. Human rights for Europeans doesn't have much value. Donald Trump said that we paid the Kurds to fight, as if Kurdish people, the noble, the brave, basically warriors and fighters were mercenaries of the United States.
Right. Which is not the case. Amir, I'm sorry, we're out of time, but I got to run. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I was just talking with one of our listeners from Los Angeles, Amir, who was saying that one of the things that is not being emphasized enough, and therefore I'm repeating essentially what he said because I agree, and I think it needs to be emphasized aggressively, is that in those regions that have been controlled by the Kurds, going back to the 1930s, they have tried to run their own controlled regions where they have local governance as secular, that is not religious, democratic republics. When the Kurdish Republic was declared in 1945, which was shot down ultimately, or betrayed by Stalin and by, I don't know who was in charge of Great Britain at the time, if Churchill still was, and the United States. They based it on American democracy. It was a secular republic. The Kurds are one of the few political groups in the Middle East who are not trying to impose Sharia law. In fact, this is the foundation of their opposition to ISIS, why they joined us in fighting ISIS, and why we were allied with them, and why they keep coming back to us to be allies. And this is who Donald Trump just turned his back on. This is who Donald Trump just poured a bucket of excrement over the top of. I mean, this is who Donald Trump signaled Erdogan, the dictator of Turkey, the guy who the last time he came to the United States stood and watched as his goons beat up Kurds on the streets in Washington, D.C., for goodness sake. And that was during the Obama administration. And Trump says, oh, yeah, come on back to the White House. We'll have a good old time. It's amazing. Bill in St. Helens, Oregon. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Tom, this is we have a man that's a president that's basically ignoring all the laws of our country anytime they're inconvenient. Now he's basically ignoring the Constitution.
Yes,
that's disturbing enough. But what's twice, triple, infinitely more disturbing is the amount of support he's getting from top Republican leaders. So let's be clear. Let's start using these words. At a minimum, this is sedition. We should be hearing that word every day in every conversation. At a minimum, this man in the Republican Party is engaging in sedition. I personally am waiting for them to burn the Reichstag.
Can you define sedition for me?
Yes, actively undermining and by the way, we've had this conversation. You like to say it has to involve violence. No, it does not. They're undermining the laws of this country. They're actually advocating not to follow the laws of the United States.
No, I've never argued that sedition has to require violence.
One time you were saying, well,
maybe I did.
It has to involve violence.
Okay, yeah. I stand corrected then, Bill.
Yeah. The second thing is, I truly believe this is a slow-moving coup. I do. When they, I posted a thing on Facebook yesterday saying, Trump doesn't get that when there are no rules, there are no rules. And This is the road we're heading down, where there are no rules. It is going to be anarchy, and it's going to be anarchy at the highest levels of our government. I'm terrified. Hopefully you're terrified. Hopefully your listeners are terrified. What's going on here is just unacceptable. This needs to be put down, and it needs to be put down now. And if it's not put down by the House or the Congress or the Senate, the American people need to start taking to the streets and saying, unacceptable, get the hell out. You are not representing our country.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Trump is calling
about this.
is calling the impeachment investigation a coup. And what I posted on Facebook today, I said, if this is how Trump plays this out, in other words, if he were to ignore the Supreme Court, then there has indeed been a coup. But it will have been a coup by the president and his cronies, not by Congress or the Democrats. And I'm with you, Bill.
Exactly.
I'm absolutely with you. Thank you very much for the call. Congressman Pocan is up next. So if you're on hold, many of our lines are full anyway. Joyce is going to double check with you that you can ask your question of Congressman Pocan, because he'll be with us for the next hour, and then we'll be back. We'll continue this conversation in the third hour of our show. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Today we're reading from Standoff, How America Became Ungovernable by Bill Schneider. This is from the first chapter, titled Old America versus New America. On November 8th, 2016, American voters did an astonishing thing. They elected a president of the United States who most voters, 61%, did not think was qualified to serve as president. How did that happen? How did we get from John F. Kennedy to Donald J. Trump? A little more than 50 years ago, the United States started on a great political journey in two opposite directions, part of the country to the right and part of the country to the left. This is the story of where we are now and how we got here. It's the story of the country's journey and my own personal journey as I covered it. It's the story of two political movements that first emerged in the 1960s. The New America is the progressive coalition of groups whose political consciousness was stirred in that decade. African Americans, young people, working people, gays, immigrants, educated professionals, and the non-religious. What holds that coalition together is a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and that commitment provoked a fierce backlash in 2016. In fact, a conservative backlash has defied the New America for more than 50 years. The backlash came from the old America, mostly white, mostly male, mostly older, mostly conservative, mostly religious, and mostly non-urban. In 2016, the old America rallied to the theme, Make America Great Again. It was a call to restore the America they feared was being swept away by a tide of political correctness. The two moments collided under President Barack Obama. Within weeks of Obama's inauguration on January 20th, 2009, a right-wing opposition movement broke out in the form of the Tea Party. Republicans rode that anger to power in Congress, gaining control of the House of Representatives in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. Within one day of Trump's inauguration, a backlash broke out on the left with a massive spontaneous women's march in Washington that drew throngs of supporters in cities across the United States. Using the Tea Party as a model, Democrats hope to ride anger on the left to power. The right and the left started their journeys at the same place, 38%. That's the vote that Barry Goldwater got in 1964 and that George McGovern got in 1972. The Republican presidential vote peaked with Richard Nixon in 72 at 61% and Ronald Reagan in 84 at 59%. The Democratic presidential vote rose to a bare majority with Jimmy Carter in 76, 50.1%, and then took 32 years to reach a majority again, whereupon the new backlash quickly set in on the right. As of 2017, the Democratic Party had less clout in national and state governments than at any time since 1928. Things started out pretty bad for Democrats. In 1972, a Democratic operative recounted the story of how George McGovern's campaign manager had called the Democratic congressional candidate in Ohio. "I have wonderful news for you," the campaign manager said. "Senator McGovern is coming to campaign in your district." "That is good news," the local candidate responded, "but I'm afraid I'm going to be in Florida visiting my mother." "Wait a minute," McGovern's campaign manager said. "I haven't told you when he's coming." "It doesn't matter," the Democratic candidate replied. "Whenever he shows up, I'll be in Florida visiting my mother." Democrats were forced to accommodate to the new conservative ascendancy. Bill Clinton, who fashioned himself a new Democrat and a proponent of the third way, got elected in 92 with 43% of the vote. The presidential vote was split three ways that year, with independent Ross Perot receiving 19%. Clinton's coattails were unimpressive. Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives in 92. It was the first election following a census and redistricting. Redistricting always puts incumbents, mostly Democrats in 92, at a disadvantage because they're forced to compete in an unfamiliar electorate. The contours of Clinton's 92 victory were different from anything Democrats had won with before. Democrats may have nominated two Southern white Baptists for president and vice president in 1992, but the Clinton-Al Gore ticket fared worse in the South. It was the only region in the country where George H.W. Bush led Clinton by 2 points. Among whites born in the South, the base of the pre-1960s Democratic coalition, Bush ran 19 points ahead of Clinton. Clinton's vote, weakest in the South and strongest in the East and West Coast, did not look like the Democratic votes that had elected Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. It resembled the votes the Democrats got when they nominated liberals such as George McGovern in 72 and Michael Dukakis in 88. That's why 92 was a breakthrough for Democrats. It was the first time they won with a vote that looked like the new America, but it was still not a majority. Clinton narrowly missed a majority when he was reelected in 1996 with 49%. Perot was on the ballot again. Al Gore carried the popular vote in 2000, but it was not quite a majority, 48%. John Kerry in 2004, same thing, 48% no victory. The breakthrough finally came in 2008 when Barack Obama won a solid majority, 53%, the highest percentage for a Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. Even so, you could argue that the 2008 Democratic vote was inflated by the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. What if there'd been no crisis? That's why Obama's re-election in 2012 came as such a shock. Obama was re-elected with a majority, 51%, despite a sluggish economic recovery. The new America came out to protect its president and to prove that its coming to power was not a fluke. However, 2016 was an even bigger shock because Trump's primary and general election victories were unexpected. Standoff, How America Became Ungovernable by Bill Schneider. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. It's the second hour of our program where it's going to be middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan on the line with us, taking your calls for the hour. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. His website, Pocan, POCAN.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, Rep Mark Pocan. And Representative Pocan, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. We've got a bunch of calls all ready to go for you, but before we do, if I may take host's privilege here and ask you two questions.
Sure.
It seems like these are the two biggest and most pressing issues of the day. We just spent a half hour interviewing Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, who is one of the leading scholars in the United States about the Kurds. He's written 2 books about the Kurds, professor of Middle Eastern history at American University, et cetera, et cetera. I've known him for a number of years. He's been on our program before. Brilliant man. And the point that he made about the Kurds is that they have always, they declared an independent republic in 1945 and declared it using essentially the American Constitution as their base. They have always been believers in secular government rather than an Islamic kind of state like so many of the other countries in the region. And that's one of the reasons that they've been so closely aligned to us repeatedly. Even though we betrayed them in 45, we betrayed them multiple times. And we're betraying them right now. I asked him, do you think that this thing could spiral out of control? Could this be the Archduke Ferdinand thing? He said that's a remote possibility, but it's a possibility. So number one, I'd like to get your thoughts on how and why Trump is betraying the Kurds and whether it has to do with his making $5 million a year off of two Trump towers in Turkey. And my second question, our Facebook post today was pointing out that Andrew Jackson, the president whose picture hangs next to Trump's desk in the White House, twice defied the U.S. Supreme Court. The Trail of Tears decision, where the Supreme Court said, no, you may not slaughter those Cherokees to create land for plantation owners, and Jackson went ahead and did it anyway. And the second was the court said you can't shut down the Second National Bank of the U.S., and Jackson did that anyway. And famously said, Judge Marshall has made his ruling, let him enforce it. I'm concerned that if, in a dispute between the executive and legislative branch, typically these are adjudicated by the Supreme Court. if Trump goes to the Supreme Court, or if you guys go to the Supreme Court and say, force Trump to give us documents and witnesses, and the court says, okay, Trump, you've got to do this, and Trump just does what Andrew Jackson does and says, I'm going to ignore you. What the hell happens? So sorry to drop a giant load right in front of you here with these two really big issues, but I'd love your thoughts on those two things, and then we'll take the rest of the hour and take calls from listeners.
Sure. I just on the first one, I don't know if I know exactly what the president's motives are. Clearly, I think I've expressed before, I think he sees himself as a reality show star first, head of the Trump organization second, and president of the United States third. So it very likely could be that relationship with Turkey that he's trying to continue for after he's president. But also, I think, he doesn't read. He doesn't study issues. And, unfortunately, I think often, he reads captions on cartoons is about the extent of how deeply he gets involved in issues. And this is one where he just didn't listen to people, thought he knew better, and clearly he was wrong. And everyone, Democrat and Republican, are disagreeing with the decision he made. But I can't specifically address his motives. So the second question, let's put it this way. I think the approach that the House Democrats are taking is different on this one. We're saying if they're going to continue to do obstruction, which they're doing, and they're saying, if you take a vote, we'll help you, and now we got an 8-page letter saying, no, they're not. I mean, they're never going to work with us, period. So there are some ways that we can still move ahead because we already have a motive, a crime, a confession, and evidence. So we're already way, way ahead of where we were in the Mueller investigation. But Nancy Pelosi has been very clear that we'll just add this to any potential articles of impeachment would be obstruction. So he's not going to just get away with it. We can still get information. We still are getting information. We have another whistleblower coming. So I'm not super concerned in the sense that I think this is a different situation, and we've got a few other tools. But also, I've just had town halls throughout my district, Tom, and many people are worried because the president thinks he's above the law. And I think, we're trying to be more creative, and that's why we did a letter yesterday to Secretary Pompeo, finding a provision, and it's in the last several appropriation bills. It says if someone directs someone not to show up, that they can have their pay withheld. And it's happened before in 2016 when the Republicans did it. So we're trying to get more creative in how we can to try to make them do the right thing. But fortunately, whistleblowers are whistleblowers, and we're moving ahead with this, I still think, in a far more expeditious manner than we ever were with the Mueller report.
Yeah, and I think your approach is brilliant. I retweeted your tweet this morning where you shared the letter that you sent saying basically Mike Pompeo, as long as he's and I guess Bill Barr, as long as they're counseling people or refusing to participate with Congress, their pay should be withheld. I thought that was brilliant. Do I have that right? The details of it right?
Yeah, whoever directs the person is the person whose pay is withheld, and it's happened previously. And I think the other thing is, and we've had this conversation with folks a little bit, is when we do criminal contempt, it has to go through the U.S. attorneys, which is what? Bill Barr. So that's not going to happen. When you do civil contempt, it has to go through the legal process. And don't forget, it took Eric Holder almost just 1 month shy of 7 years to get some resolution in a suit they had with him. A lot of the tools that people think we have, we really don't have in a very quick manner, which is why I think we have to start being more creative and being tougher. And that was just one, hopefully, creative idea we're trying to offer to how we can move ahead.
Great. Okay, let's pick up phone calls here. Beth, in Valparaiso, Indiana, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Congressman. I listen almost every week when you're doing this show, and I know that every single week there are Democrats and other independents who call and say, why can't we get our message out better? And you patiently explain things to us, and I appreciate it. But here's my big question for you today is Tom's been telling us about a $6 million ad buy that Trump's people have done about corruption of the Democrats. Where's our $6 million ad buy from the DNC to counter this? And maybe we could end the ad with for unity with every single Democratic candidate at the end saying, we approve this message. And let's tick off the corruption, just like Robert Reich did the other day in his tweet. We got to fight back, and, we can hire PR people, too. So let's get it going, man. And we've got to make emoluments, I think. Emoluments, I think, should be part of the charges that we file, too. That's part of it to convince America.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on the first part, I'm not sure what the DNC is doing. It is a separate entity than House Democrats or Senate Democrats, so I don't know if they have anything planned. I really can't specifically address that. But I can say right now we're winning the messaging battle on this because you look at public opinion polls and they're moving so quickly. And part of why I think they're moving so quickly is while on the Mueller report we knew an outside government interfered in our elections, but Donald Trump denied knowing anything, and we were trying to get to see if he was telling us the truth or not, and he was blocking witnesses. This is a very different situation. Here's another foreign government that he's asking, and he's admitted it, and he's given us the notes, and people can connect the pattern of what's going on. So he said he didn't do that, but in this case, he did, and it's the same action, and that's why we're seeing public opinion going. So if I don't have my colleagues, House Democrats, who are getting nervous because of their advertising, and I've not heard that yet, I think that we are doing a good job in messaging on this, and the public, again, is way smarter than Republicans think they are.
Yeah. Let's hope. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm like hoping. I'm hoping. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us for the hour, taking your calls. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. You can find his website at pocan.house.gov, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, Rep Mark, M-A-R-K, Pocan.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option. We are going to get active. We're going to win this thing. And welcome back. Rick in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan. Rick? I'm not hearing Rick. Let's try.
Yeah, yes, you are.
Okay.
Yes, you are. You hear me now?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, yeah, I know. Something went wrong with my phone. Here's my question for him regarding the removal of Trump. Maybe it's a crazy idea. Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just not. Maybe I'm losing it. But why couldn't Congress hire a security, and then if he's voted to be removed, then why couldn't they go into the physically remove him? Or would that create such an anarchy? It would be,
You mean like hire Blackwater instead of the okay. Congressman? Your thoughts?
Yeah, Rick, you're a few steps ahead, I think, of where we're at right now. So I'm sure some people are thinking of all options down the road, but
it might make a good movie.
Yeah, I just don't see it happening yet as far as having a problem with the president. I mean, clearly, his language is outrageous. When he talks about treason, civil war, a coup, but that's Donald Trump. He's a reality show star, right? And he's just being, putting these really terrible terms, trying to keep his base aware of what's going on. But again, I really do have faith in the people. I was in the most rural, more conservative corners of my district, and the same issues came up as they did in Madison, Wisconsin, one of my most progressive areas. People don't want someone who thinks they're above the law. They don't want someone to put their own interest over the national security, and people are figuring this out. So we'll see what steps we get to, Rick, but right now I'm not too concerned.
Harry in Aurora, Colorado. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, hi, Congressman. I have one question. Do you and your colleagues feel that Trump suffers from any form of mental illness?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a question that just about everyone thinks that he has some kind of disorder when it comes to narcissism. I mean, this is a guy who always puts himself into the center of any conversation, thinks of himself first and foremost, and doesn't really do what most every other president's done, which is try to unify a nation. Instead, it's all about him and his businesses and how he's looked at, and then he talks about being a very stable genius and a bunch of other things that certainly fall in that column. So I guess I would say there is definitely consensus that this guy is a serious narcissist.
We had Sean, help me with his name, the professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University. You're brain farting on it too. Anyhow, we had one of the country's most famous psychiatrists. He wrote Bush on the couch and Trump on the couch and Obama on the couch. And the point that he made, the real danger is that Trump is essentially a cult leader, and when cult leaders are backed into a corner, they tend to commit suicide and take as many people with them as they can, whether it was Hitler or Jim Jones or, it's happened in politics, it's happened in religion. Dr. Justin Frank is his name. Thoughts on that? We have 20 seconds to the break.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that's why Donald Trump will be glad to throw anyone around him under the bus, but I think ultimately Donald Trump loves Donald Trump so much that I don't think he's going to do anything that would hurt himself. But I think, if he throws Mike Pence under the bus, if that would save him...
I was thinking about taking the whole country down by getting into World War III or something.
I think there's enough safeguards that would be very unlikely to happen.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. I mean, that's my prayer. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. Stick around. Of America has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. .com, and you can get over there and check it out. It's pretty amazing. Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the big cheese, no Wisconsin pun intended, of progressives in the U.S. House of Representatives, on the line with us for the hour, taking your calls, middays with Mark. And Winston in Salem, Virginia, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, Congressman and Tom, I have a very quick question for you. Is there any plans in the future to create an agency, just like we created the Department of Homeland Security, to create an agency that has arrest powers that will only enter Congress and the Supreme Court? I think we're in a constitutional crisis right now.
In other words, is there any anticipation that Congress may take onto itself the police powers that are granted exclusively to the executive branch in the Constitution? That's the essence of your question, Winston.
Yes, that is the essence of my question. We need a separate branch, right?
Yeah, thank Congressman.
Yeah, Winston, I haven't heard any direct conversation. I'm not saying that there hasn't been. I haven't heard it personally. Again, I think we're all experiencing this at the same time, and this is the one bit of patience I guess I ask for everyone to kind of share with us is, this has only happened 4 times in our nation's history, and here we are living through it together in history, and, we may not get everything right along the way. We're doing our very best. People are working very hard. Who knew you'd have a White House so arrogant, so much thinking they're above the law that they'll comply with nothing, or at least they're saying they're going to comply with nothing. So we're coming up with ways along the route to figure out how to address this. The good news is, in this situation, we have a motive, we have a crime, we have a confession, we have evidence, which is putting us leaps and bounds ahead of where we were with the Mueller report. And I think that provides me with a lot of confidence that I think we can move forward on this.
John in San Francisco, listening on Real Talk 910. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello.
Hey, John, you're on the air. You're talking to Congressman Pocan.
Thanks, Tom. Congressman Pocan, I really like that suggestion that you guys initiate withholding pay to the people in the White House. I also had a suggestion along that line. I've said this before, that could we draw up a document which says that anybody who threatens our democracy or our republic can be subject to extraordinary rendition? Thanks for your response.
Boy, we're getting some. People are really pushing the boundaries here, sir.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could try to do anything, right? The question is how enforceable, especially when it's that loose. But, Tom, what's happening is what happened at all my town halls in the last 2 weeks. And I think what's happened over the last few months on the calls is people are just really concerned about our democracy, right? This is a president who's acting unlike any previous president, Democrat or Republican, who thinks he is so above the law that when whoever would think someone would be elected president who said I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and no one would care, and yet now he's trying to prove that he can get away with anything. This is just a new experience. So we're pushing forward. The good news is we learned a few of his tricks during the Mueller report. His arrogance put him to the point of doing what he did with the Ukrainian president, and now we have a number of whistleblowers coming forward. This is a good thing, and I think we're finally going to be able to get some resolution.
Maureen in San Antonio, Texas. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, John, you're on the air.
Hello?
Hi, Maureen. You're on the air. You need to turn your radio down.
Oh, I'm on the air because I'm watching your program and I'm not. Well,
there's
what
about
I'm
a 12-second delay.
Is a comment. Pardon?
You go ahead with your question.
I wanted your opinion on a comment I heard by Pat Robinson, who's an evangelical pastor, and he said that Trump could lose its mandate from heaven. And I was hoping that might change the minds of some of the evangelicals who support Trump. Do you think that that's possible?
Congressman?
Boy, Pat, there's a lot of things I've thought were possible that have not come true when it comes to Donald Trump. First of all, Donald Trump, is about as artificial, Christian as I've seen, right? I mean, this is a guy who has done very little in his life to show that he abides by any so-called Christian principles, and yet, he's got support because he said a couple key things that are important. And in this case, I think what you're really seeing is some of where people really want it, they know what he's doing is wrong, but they can't say anything on impeachment because their futures are tied to it. This seems to be the issue that's allowed them to vent, because not only is the president doing the complete wrong thing, it just gives them that ability to kind of have a unified message on this a little bit, and I think that's what you're really seeing more than anything. I just wish they would take that same anger and distrust and direct it where it needs to be, which is this president has abused, betrayed his oath of office, and we need to collectively stand up against that.
Yeah. Congressman, we have only 40 seconds to the break. How do you see Trump's bond, her specific reference to Pat Robertson? He was talking about Syria, because the Kurds in northern Syria, among them live a lot of Christians, and the Syrian Defense Force wasn't just Kurds. It was Kurds and Christians in North Syria. And right now, Erdogan's Turkey is crushing both of them, bombing the families of both of them. Do you think that that's going to finally shake the evangelicals, or do you think that they're living in such a bubble they don't know what's going on?
I think as long as he says he's going to stop abortion, they will come right back in line very, very quickly.
Yeah. And
I've never seen a whole lot of genuineness or unanimity of thought among the so-called Christian right, especially the political leaders, because they're more politicians than Christian.
Yeah, which is really a tragedy. It really is.
Yeah.
Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. We'll be back with more of your questions for him in just a moment.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program, occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. Our book today is Future War, Preparing for the New Global Battlefield by Robert, I believe it's pronounced Latif, L-A-T-I-F-F. This is from the introduction. On a sweltering August day following weeks of heightened tension with Russia over its actions in Ukraine and Syria, and harsh words between the United States and China over actions in the South China Sea, and as workers are preparing to depart the cool of their air-conditioned Manhattan office buildings for the gridlocked highways and subways, Several large electric power plants along the East Coast simultaneously experienced dramatic overspeed conditions in their large turbine generators. Plant operators are unable to stop the steam turbines, whose automatic control and data systems have been infected by sophisticated computer malware, and they catastrophically tear themselves apart, cutting power to large segments of the population and industries in the Northeast. Building systems shut down, hospitals switch to emergency generators, trains stop running, traffic lights cease operating, and Wall Street trading comes to a halt. At the same time, 1,100 miles to the south, a massive rocket sits fueled and ready to launch a critical national security satellite when an explosive-laden private aircraft flies at low altitude into the Cape Canaveral launch pad area and, despite repeated warnings, slams into the pressurized fuel tank and solid rocket motors, creating an enormous conflagration. Half a world away, elite commandos equipped with the latest high-technology equipment but unidentifiable as a national army attack U.S. and allied interests near areas of disputed territory. Thus are fired the opening shots of a new war. These hypothetical events represent a radically different style of conflict fought with new tools and against new and unfamiliar enemies. When most people think of war, they imagine soldiers doing battle with other soldiers, employing tanks, artillery, and other recognizable weapons. However, in this century, war has morphed into something we can scarcely recognize, and future conflicts will be qualitatively and quantitatively unlike those of the past. They will be fought using innovative and unusual weapons, many of which, because the technologies have both civilian and military uses, will be available to far more people who are far less skilled in their employment. The so-called democratization of technology has diminished the monopoly of advanced countries on the tools of war. 21st century armed conflicts often have no battlefield in the traditional sense. The concept of opposing armies clashing in deadly struggle but moderated by international conventions of behavior seems a thing of the past. In 1999, Chinese colonels Kuo Liang and Wang Shuangshui predicted that soldiers would increasingly be computer hackers, financiers, drug smugglers, and agents of private corporations rather than members of a military, and that their weapons would include not only airplanes, cannons, poison gas bombs, and biochemical agents, but also computer viruses, net browsers, and financial derivative tools. Their predictions were prescient. Yesterday's wars were, like World War II, about saving civilized nations from maniacal dictators, or like the conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, devoted to a clash of ideologies in the attempt to limit the spread of one hegemon over another. They were big affairs involving large military forces and enormous violence. Today's wars are more about cultural and religious hatreds, using violence as a means to change the hearts and minds of people, among whom the killing occurs with more frequency. Tomorrow's wars will be different still, fought largely for political dominance with stealth and cunning, targeting innocents and institutions, heavily dependent on information superiority, and employing strange new weapons. While we have a highly motivated and well-trained and equipped armed forces that will adapt, we are not prepared as a nation to react well to the inevitably messy and ambiguous situations these new conflicts and weapons will present. We still have no clear idea of what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace now, nor of how we might respond to such an act. It is not enough for the military to be prepared. Neither the public nor its decision makers have yet fully comprehended the significance of the changes in the types of conflict and the tools with which they will be fought. Without question, there will be circumstances when decision makers will find it necessary, or at least think it necessary, to send soldiers into classic boots-on-the-ground combat situations. We will continue to project force with our powerful aircraft, our munitions, and our aircraft carrier strike groups. When war is fought in foreign lands, it could well be against other high-tech armies. However, war will increasingly be more personal and often fought closer to home. It will not lend itself to the traditional massive displays of U.S. firepower. It will affect individuals directly, not as some distant conflict we read about in newspapers or watch in the movies or on the internet. Americans will be targeted on U.S. soil, often, as we have seen in San Bernardino and Orlando, by homegrown terrorists. This form of war will be messy and complex, and it will not lend itself to easy, quick, soundbite solutions. It may not even be clear for a while who perpetrated the violence against us. Was it state-sponsored or a random act of terror? Will we unleash massive destruction on foreign countries in retaliation for attacks by terrorists residing on our own soil? If so, to what end and with what consequences? There are always consequences, whether they be the death or capture of our own troops, unnecessary civilian casualties, or the incitement of more violence. The book Future War by Robert Latif. Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. All about it here. And welcome back. It's Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, taking your calls for the hour. And Ronald in Milwaukee, listening on 1510 a.m. Ronald, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
I only have one thing to say. I think the Democrats have got to start running ads on TV. I know it's going to cost money. Go after your base. I'll be happy to contribute. Borrow money, but you have to start running ads and educating the American people about what's going on. We are going to lose our democracy, and the dumbass people don't know it and go after his base somehow, and that's it. Goodbye.
I would add Facebook to that. Trump just spent $1 million on Facebook, and they've changed their rules in the last 3 days, as Judd Legum has documented, to allow Trump's ads to tell lies, even ads that CNN refuses. Facebook will take.
Yeah, as we know, this is one area where they're always going to have more money than us, and it's hard to try to fight back on that issue. So, I think right now we are winning in some of the framing of this. Clearly, the public opinion is going our way, but I don't know if we really solve much of what the very real angst is out there by just saying put something up on advertising. Because right now, all this information is so fresh, you never keep up with it. Yet all this information is exactly what's moving public opinion polls. So at some point, it could very likely happen. But right now, the information is getting out there, and we are on the winning side of this issue.
Okay. Whoa. Something just, there we go. Lee in Tucson, Arizona. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi. Yes. Our entire intelligence community and even the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee has assessed that Russia and other foreign actors have been and are currently actively trying to undermine our election integrity and influence our elections. So we are in a state of cyber warfare. Now, during wartime, anyone willingly giving aid to adversaries is committing an act of treason. Yet Senator Mitch McConnell is single-handedly blocking all votes related to ensuring our election integrity. So why are we not charging him with treason?
Yeah, well, part of it, Lee, I think, is there's a legislative process. We have sent the bill, a very narrow bill, to address other countries' involvement to the Senate. And I think the fact that he has got a nickname, Moscow Mitch, is putting real pressure on him to the point that he said he would take the bill up. Now, we haven't seen that action happen yet, and there still is more pressure. And for Republican senators who aren't putting pressure on him, they're going to have to explain why it's all right. So I think that we still have, if the public gets involved and calls their U.S. senators, a good chance to get that bill through the Senate. I think something else, if I can, Lee, I think that's important, and I've made this comment through my town halls, is that it does seem like this president has spent the last nearly 3 years doing everything he can to clear Russia of their involvement in our elections. Again, in this call, don't forget, it wasn't just getting dirt on Joe Biden's family. It was pushing this conspiracy theory that somehow really the hacking came in from a server in the Ukraine and the DNC and all this. And it's all because in the Mueller report, the president is so afraid that he is going to be seen as illegitimate because of Russia's involvement. And I think that's something we need to talk about a whole lot more, too, because I don't think it gets the same attention as some of these other issues.
Rachel in Memphis, Tennessee, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, I just wanted to make or ask a quick question and then make a quick comment. I wanted to go back to kind of a basic policy and take a step back from Trump. I would like to know, how is it in my interest as a citizen, I'm an ordinary citizen in Tennessee, for us to arm and support basically a proxy war in Ukraine on Russia's border, because I don't see how that is making me safer, or because, something could happen, and I find that pretty reckless. And then also, I'm also disturbed by the Cold War McCarthyite rhetoric that has consumed society over the past 3 years. I find it just despicable, as far as everything Russia and Russian is. Overt xenophobia seems to be totally acceptable in America, and I find that despicable. Thank you.
Sure. So, Rachel, to your first part of your question, Ukraine is an ally of ours, and that's why we have agreements and we provide support in that sense. So that's kind of the short answer to that. To the second part, I'm not disagreeing with you that some people who are automatically just anti-Russia because we've been anti-Russia since Ronald Reagan. I think there's way too much of that. I agree with you on that front. However, it is completely undeniable that the Russians tried to interfere with our elections, and they likely will again, and you can't accept that as an answer. And much of the pushback we've tried to provide is that to that point. The president, I think, largely because he's got $1 billion to make in Russia from licensing his name, has been, between that and not wanting to be seen as illegitimate because he had Russian help, has been doing just the complete opposite of what any normal president would do. But I don't disagree. There are some people, especially on the Republican side, Republican senators, who just want to live that Cold War forever and ever and ever, and it helps feed the military-industrial complex. Although I hope you recognize the difference between that and those of us who are saying no government should be able to interfere in our elections. And unfortunately, Russia did try to interfere in ours.
Rich in Sedro-Woolley, Washington. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, good morning, Tom. Good morning, Congressman. I am wondering, I think I share the interest of, hello?
Yeah, you're
I share the interest of many of, yeah, I'm here. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, just fine. Go.
Okay, I share the interest with many of Tom's listeners. How do we get Lincoln's hearse displayed in the Smithsonian?
Instead of in what used to be the jail cell in the basement of the Capitol? Is that what you're talking about, Rich?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Is there a number we can call, a website we can go to?
Okay, Congressman.
Wow. Honestly, Rich, you're giving me a question. I really don't have a whole lot of words. This is one where I don't know enough about where to direct you on that. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to provide the assistance I'd like to.
Okay, from Rich to Rich. This is Rich in Mission Viejo, California. Rich, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. I'm glad to talk to you again. And Congressman Pocan, is there any way at all that they can charge Mitch McConnell with obstruction of justice? Because basically he's his big backbone, and we have to get rid of Trump. I am so desperate to get rid of Trump. I don't know what to do anymore or what to say anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are paths to do it. The problem is right now, him just not taking up our legislation is a little hard to, I think, necessarily justify that's obstruction of justice, right? So we've passed, I think, 247 bills in the House so far this year. The Republican Senate has passed like 63. The Republican Senate has taken up only 38 of the 247 bills we've given them. So while we have many beefs and we are trying to put pressure on and ask people to call their senators and ask them to take up whatever bill it is that you care about that they're not doing, I don't know if obstruction through the normal process is necessarily going to work. Now, never say never. We're not sure. This has been the most, I think, unique period of a lot of our lives in watching federal government. But at this point, I think we're still trying to do the pressure through the normal system. And often, one house or the other might not pass bills from the other side, not to the extreme that we're seeing of the Senate Republicans. They're pretty much taking nothing. But often there's some, so to speak, horse trading that happens down the road about what gets taken up. So I think it might be a little premature.
We have a hard break in this hour at 45, which is in 15 seconds. Do you see any cracks in the Senate, among the Senate Republicans?
You know, the fact that most of them have been pretty silent tells me they're being a little more thoughtful. I thought when Ron Johnson from Wisconsin actually asked the president about the question and brought it up early about this quid pro quo, now he's gone totally into conspiracy land, drank the MAGA red Kool-Aid. So no one overtly that I'm seeing.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. We'll be back with Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of the state of Wisconsin. His website is Pocan, POCAN.house.gov. And you can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan, as in Representative Mark Pocan. We'll be right back. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
You're listening to Talk Media for the rest of us, the place where smart people get their news. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Tim in Milwaukee, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello. I was just wondering if Trump's two sons, Junior and Eric, if their tax returns could be subpoenaed or requested for some type of emoluments violation.
Good question.
Tim, yeah, I think the one issue I would raise is they're not on the payroll of the federal government, and the emoluments clause doesn't directly relate to them. So perhaps not. Having said that, though, you do raise an issue, Tim, I'd like to bring up, which is if you notice the president keeps going after Joe Biden's son about business dealings. What have we watched with every single one of the children of Donald Trump? And that's all they've done is go around the globe making money off their dad being president. And yet he doesn't see the hypocrisy in the statements that he's putting out there. So I understand what you're getting at, Tim. I just don't know if the emoluments clause is the right vehicle to do that.
Tatiana in Highland Park, New Jersey, listening on WBAI. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, yes. Hi, Tom. I can't believe that. First time ever calling. I just couldn't stop myself from this topic that you brought up at the beginning, because this is kind of very high on my list, inner list, you know. I think you just hit the right button.
So your
here.
question, Tatiana, for Congressman Pocan is? We only have 2 minutes before we hit a break.
Yes, okay. My question is basically, let me say a very brief comment. So I heard this idea for decades that basically humans go into technocratic development and they forget to develop the other values, kind of you understand what I mean? Kind of not.
Talking about morals and values.
Right, moral and values and how to communicate with each other and not to kill each other and all that stuff is kind of behind. So my point is, for a long time I've been thinking what can be done, because in a way there is no education we like kids from they're not born, and they have these, gadgets to play with.
So is your question for Congressman Pocan, how can we better educate our young people about morals, values, and civics?
Exactly. It has
Okay,
to be.
great. Let's let him answer, because we just have a minute till we hit the break. Tatiana, thank you for the call, and thank you for listening to WBAI. Congressman?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tatiana. I mean, one thing I know that I think is something that hopefully could be a nonpartisan issue is just making sure that you have basic civics education in all of our schools, and that's something we can do at the local level and encourage our local school boards to have that education provided. Because issues like that, issues like financial literacy, certain issues are just basic skills that we should be, I think, providing more information about, especially as early as possible, especially around civics. And I think that might help to the issue that you're raising. So that would just be one thought offhand.
Yeah, Richard Dreyfuss is all over this. He's got a website and everything. He's been pushing this for years. Been on this program. But he seems to be a lone voice in the wilderness, for civics education. It's really remarkable. So, yeah. Well, anyhow, we'll be back in just a moment with more of your calls for Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the representative from the state of Wisconsin's 2nd District, in just a moment. Stick around. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. And I see I have to read a Simply Safe live read here. So we will be back in 1 minute. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. It's our new, just for the people who are Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Jeff in Portland, Oregon, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, good day, Tom and Congressman. Thank you both for what you do. Congressman, kudos to you on your letter to Pompeo. The Democratic leadership needs to stand strong and steadfast against this attack on 230 years of the rule of law. The good news, I think, is it's happening now. We can only imagine if it was closer to the 2020 election and how they would try and steamroll right over the election, regardless of the results. So my question to you, Congressman, Ari Berman tweeted the other day that Trump isn't just asking foreign countries to investigate his political rivals, but once again to interfere in our elections. How concerned are you about election integrity in 2020, and does H.R. 1 require hand-marked paper ballots?
So on H.R. 1, I can answer that part first. It does require paper ballots, and so does the SAFE Act, the specific bill we sent to the Senate just to deal with outside interference. So it's not as broad as H.R. 1, but it very specifically would deal with outside influence. I do think the one bit of good news I can offer, Jeff, is because we've been through what just happened, we know more what to look for, and I think people have across the board, whether it be the companies that make the machines, whether it be the states that run elections, people have beefed up systems in many cases. You've got social media now knowing what to look for, which they weren't ready for in the last election cycle. So no matter what, we're in a better position. But also, having said that, I don't think that changes them trying to stop doing what they're going to try to do. So we're going to have to be vigilant together when that happens.
Omar in Herndon, Virginia, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Pocan, when Nancy Pelosi becomes temporary president, you're going to be a vice president or a speaker of the House. You have to pick one.
Do you think there's a possibility, apropos of that, do you think there's a possibility that we might have articles of impeachment that include both Trump and Pence at the same time? Or would that just explode the heads of the Republicans because it would lead directly to President Pelosi?
I'll tell you, the questions you're asking, Tom, and your listeners ask are what I just heard over by all my town halls in the last 2 weeks, and I told everyone if I could predict that, I would be a headliner in Vegas, right? I don't know if any of us can really say what exactly is going to happen because we don't. Every day it seems like we're learning more information, more whistleblowers. So I don't have a great answer on that other than right now I just want to make sure we're doing our jobs and we're moving forward. And right now I've been very satisfied with the direction of Speaker Pelosi. And Adam has done a great job, and so has Jerry Nadler on Judiciary. So we're just going to keep plugging forward.
Okay. Michael in Denver, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, sir. Hi. Honored to speak to you. My question is, and I have a short comment afterwards. Congressman, I've been hearing about precedents that have been set with Clinton and with Nixon that they, that the president may not, have to hand over information or go and testify in front of Congress. Is this a huge roadblock? I mean, I'm going to throw away the Book of American History because I thought that the Constitution would say this is it. It's in ink and parchment here, and anything that comes out of that you can debate, but this is still what is the law of the land. And my comment is, sir, 22 years, and I've called before, in the Navy, South China Sea, what I'm seeing is a whitewash of everything. And I have people that died in Normandy, and I don't like that, Congressman, at all, what's been going on. So you and the Democrats in Congress and in the Senate and all of us have to get tough and all. I'm ready to punch, the political punch, okay? I don't want the other punches to follow behind. That's what I have to say in my question to you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, and I'll tell you, that's what I heard in my town halls. And then one of the things I and I'm sure other members are bringing back is people want us to be tough during this because the president's certainly not afraid to break the law. We need to, within the law, fight back with every tool we have. Specifically, I think you were probably addressing executive privilege. And while that is a reality, it's not enough to really cause serious enough problems for how we're moving ahead. Because don't forget, we have a confession. We have a crime and a motive, and we have some evidence in the notes that have given to us, and we have 2 whistleblowers now, and we're continuing to gather more information. So I don't think we can move ahead even when the president decides to stonewall us, especially in this case. So we have got a very unique situation, I think, that's going to put us in a good place to move forward.
Congressman, we just have 40 seconds here and not enough for a last question. Your thoughts as we go into this week? I hope, if people are calling 202-225-3121 to get in touch with their representatives, what should they be focusing on? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, and this is your last chance to get your member of Congress or the Senate while they're home. We all go back next week. We're going to be taking up prescription drugs and other things in the House. But there's nothing better than a face-to-face visit, whether it be an official meeting or just running into them at an event they're at, and have that conversation to their face, make them look you in the eye and say why they don't want to hold Donald Trump accountable. Single best thing you can do with your time in the next week.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much, Congressman Mark Pocan. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, as always, thank you, and all your listeners.
Yep, thank you, and look forward to next week. Always great talking with Congressman Pocan. So we will be back. We're going to talk to Mark Karlin about Trump destroying evidence. This is getting interesting. Right after this, stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book in today's Thom Hartmann Book Club is On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal by Naomi Klein. This is from the epilogue, the very end of the book, and it's titled The Capsule Case for a Green New Deal. Critics of the Green New Deal have plenty of serious arguments for why all this is doomed. Political paralysis in Washington is real. Even in a world where climate change denying Republicans were swept out of power, there would still be plenty of centrist Democrats convinced that their constituents had no appetite for radical change. The plans are expensive, and getting the budgets approved will be a Herculean effort. A better course of action, we hear, would be to advance climate policies that appeal to many on the right, like a shift from coal to nuclear power, or a small tax on carbon that returns the revenues as a dividend to every citizen. The main trouble with these incremental approaches is that they simply won't get the job done. In order to win support from Republicans soaked in fossil fuel money, the price on carbon would be too low to make much of an impact. Nuclear power is expensive and slow to roll out compared with renewables, and that's not to mention the risks associated with uranium mining and waste storage. The truth is, we cannot lower emissions as steeply and as rapidly as required to swerve off our perilous trajectory without a sweeping industrial and infrastructure overhaul. The good news is that the Green New Deal isn't nearly as impractical or unrealistic as its many critics claim. I've made the case for why that is throughout the book, but what follows are 9 more reasons the Green New Deal has a fighting chance, a chance that will increase every time we go out and make the case. 1, it will be a massive job creator. Every part of the world that has invested heavily in renewables and in efficiency has found these sectors to be much more powerful job creators than fossil fuels. When New York State made a commitment to get half its energy from renewables by 2030, it immediately saw a spike in job creation. The accelerated timeline of the U.S. Green New Deal will turn it into a jobs machine. Even without federal support, indeed with active sabotage from the White House, the green economy is already creating more jobs than oil and gas. According to the 2018 U.S. Energy and Employment Review, jobs in wind, solar energy efficiency, and other clean energy sectors outnumbered fossil fuels by a rate of 3 to 1. This is happening because of a combination of state and municipal incentives and the plummeting costs of renewables. A Green New Deal would take the industry supernova while ensuring that the jobs have salaries and benefits comparable to those offered in the oil and gas sector. There's no shortage of research to support this. For instance, a 2019 study on the job impacts of a Green New Deal-style program in the state of Colorado found that many more jobs would be created than lost. The study, published by the Department of Economics and Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, looked at what it would take for the state to achieve a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. It found that roughly 585 non-management jobs would be lost, but that with an investment of $14.5 billion a year in clean energy, quote, Colorado will generate about 100,000 jobs per year in the state. There are many more studies with similarly striking findings. A plan put forward by the U.S. Blue-Green Alliance, a body that brings together unions and environmentalists, estimated that a $40 billion annual investment in public transit and high-speed rail for 6 years would produce more than 3.5 million jobs during that period. And according to a report from the European Transport Workers Federation, comprehensive policies to reduce emissions in the transport sector by 80% would create 7 million new jobs across that continent, while another 5 million clean energy jobs in Europe would slash electricity emissions by 90%. Number 2, paying for it will create a fairer economy. As the 2018 IPCC report on keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius made clear, if we don't take transformative action to lower emissions, the cost will be astronomical. The panel's estimate is that the economic damages of allowing temperatures to increase by 2 degrees Celsius, as opposed to 1.5, would hit $69 trillion globally. Of course, rolling out a Green New Deal would have large costs as well, and the plan's advocates have pointed to a variety of ways this can be financed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said that the U.S. version should be financed the way any previous emergency spending has been, by the U.S. Congress simply authorizing the funds, backstopped by the Treasury, the world's currency of last resort. According to New Consensus, the think tank closely associated with their policy proposals, because, quote, the Green New Deal will produce new goods and services to keep pace with and absorb new expenditures, there is no more reason to let fear about financing halt progress than there was to let it halt wars or tax cuts, end quote. The European Spring proposal for a Green New Deal, meanwhile, calls for a global minimum corporate tax rate to capture the tax revenue that the Apples and Googles of the world currently dodge with transnational schemes. It also calls for a reversal of monetary orthodoxy, with public investment floating green bonds supported by central banks. Quote, to address the true existential threat that we face today, we must reverse the economic policies that brought us to this brink. Austerity means extinction, end quote. Some analysts like Christian Parenti have emphasized that federal governments can drive the transition with their purchasing policies. In short, there are all kinds of ways to raise financing, including ways that attack untenable levels of wealth concentration and shift the burden to those most responsible for climate pollution. And it's not hard to figure out who that is. We know, thanks to research from the Climate Accountability Institute, that a whopping 71% of greenhouse gas emissions since 1988 can be traced to just 100 corporations. On Fire by Naomi Klein.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just a heads up to people in the Portland area. Tomorrow night, I'll be at Powell's City of Books on Burnside at 7:30 p.m. giving a talk on the hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America, and signing books and all that kind of stuff. So just heads up. On the line with us is Mark Karlin, my old buddy, and has brought back to life BuzzFlash.com, which has for well over a decade, maybe multiple decades, been a really consequential progressive website and source of news, BuzzFlash.com, and his Twitter handle is @BuzzFlash. Mark, welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be back.
Thank you. You wrote an op-ed yesterday that people can find over at BuzzFlash.com suggesting that there are clues hiding in plain sight. For example, the Justice Department refusing to say that they will preserve documents that Congress has asked them to preserve, that what we might be seeing here being played out is what Roger Stone famously advised Richard Nixon to do. Nixon decided to do what was legal and right and preserve the White House tapes. Roger Stone suggested that he should have burned them. And I think in retrospect, had he burned them, he may have survived that impeachment. You're suggesting that Donald Trump might be doing the same thing, basically burning the tapes?
Exactly. As a matter of fact, there was a Politico story in 2018 that, and this is, as many things Trumpian, almost unbelievable, but that Trump regularly tears up documents, correspondence, official memos, and this is in the Politico article, so it's not some sort of conspiracy theory, but there are actually 2 or 3 civil servants who are in the executive office building are paid more than $60,000 a year to reassemble the documents that Trump tears up with Scotch tape.
Now, I read that like 2 years ago, and I'm wondering if Trump read that and if he's put an end to that. If either,
I don't think he's put an end to that. In fact, what I document in my commentary is there's something called the Presidential Records Act, and that requires that certain documents be maintained for storage in an ongoing presidential archive. This is particularly applicable to meetings with foreign leaders or phone calls. And in May of this year, 3 watchdog groups, this is before the infamous July 26th Zelensky call, filed suit against the Trump administration for not complying with the Presidential Records Act and indeed not even keeping a record of meetings and calls that he had with some foreign leaders, specifically several meetings and calls with Putin. And the case is winding its way through the courts, but last week the judge who's overseeing it, Amy Berman Jackson, in a federal district court in Washington, ordered the White House to preserve documents and to preserve records of those of meetings with and phone calls with foreign leaders. I think these ethics groups are seeking an injunction that would have an enforceable mechanism, because the judge says to Trump, you have to do this, you have to keep records. But as we know from the whistleblower, many of these records, if they are kept at all, of phone calls with foreign leaders that are meetings that are questionable, go into a top secret server. One meeting that I'm sure you have made mention of on your program is a 2017 meeting that Trump had in the Oval Office with 2 very high-ranking Russian officials, in which, according to the Washington Post, a leaker told them that Trump told these Russian officials not to worry about their meddling in the 2016 election, because even the U.S. meddles in other people's elections.
Right.
We don't have a record, a transcript of that meeting, and that is required by the Presidential Records Act. And clearly, Trump is not complying. This goes to the very essence of the whistleblower's point about the Zelensky call being kept on the full transcript being kept on a classified server. So the peril that Trump may indeed delete these records is extremely high.
So what, I mean, this goes back to, something that I was pointing out in the first hour of the program, and in fact, it was our paragraph for Facebook today on our show's Facebook page, which is basically the court of last resort here in a dispute between the legislative and between the legislative and executive branch. In other words, if Congress says we want these records and Trump says you can't have them, or even says I've destroyed them, it goes to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court rules, and God only knows what's going to happen there, because you got 2 Trump appointees and a 5-4 majority. But even if the court rules against Donald Trump, Trump's hero in terms of presidents is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's picture hangs right next to his desk, the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. Andrew Jackson was going to be taken off the $20 bill and replaced by Harriet Tubman, and Donald Trump and Stephen Mnuchin put a stop to that. And what happened when the Supreme Court, when Andrew Jackson was sued over the Trail of Tears over relocating Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And Andrew Jackson is said to have said, well, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. The Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism outside of turning to the executive branch, to the president, and saying, please enforce the law. And if it's the president who's violating the law, what do we do, Mark?
Well, we are in jeopardy. I mean, this is what he's doing in terms of the letter that was sent to Congress yesterday. He's basically declaring war on the Constitution,
yes.
The constitutional role of Congress to launch an impeachment inquiry and to proceed with impeachment if it's warranted.
And provide oversight.
So he's saying he is above the law. And Nixon said that, but he ultimately complied once I think it was a guy named Alexander Butterfield, if I recall.
Yes.
He, in congressional testimony, made a stunning remark that there was a tape system in the White House, and it was that which led to, as you mentioned, Nixon turning over the tapes. There was an infamous 18-and-a-half-minute gap in one of the key tapes, and I think that's what we're seeing with Trump. He's still referring to the Zelensky phone call. He said a few days back that it was a verbatim transcript down to every comma.
Right.
And we know from the whistleblower that that's not true, but it throws the press off in several CNN articles and even in the Washington Post. I've still seen it referred to as a transcript.
Right. When it first came out, I pointed out on this program that there were 3 places where there were ellipses, ... which means something has been deleted. And that if you read the transcript out loud or the summary out loud, it comes to 11 minutes, but according to the timestamp, it was a 30-minute conversation. Obviously, there's a bunch of stuff that's been deleted from that. It's just, I guess this gets back to this question of, what do we do? How do we do this? And it seems to me that Congress needs to move, really rapidly to impeach this guy, and because I don't think he's going to be held to account by any other mechanism. Do you know of any, Mark?
I think that Trump has established that he is hunkering down in the White House and that will take a dumpster truck to remove him. The only enforcement mechanism is Congress. I think these watchdog groups have been seeking since May to basically have an injunction issued by the judge that would appoint an overseer outside the White House to make sure that they're complying with the Presidential Records Act, and that Trump would, and he still hasn't accounted for these meetings with Putin.
Yeah, there's a lot that we need to know. Mark Karlin, the website buzzflash.com, a great place to get your news. And, of course, Mark's brilliant, often extraordinarily insightful commentaries every day. Mark, thanks a lot for dropping by.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure.
Great talking with you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your comments right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
16 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Fair and only slightly unbalanced. And welcome back. Tim in Houston, Texas. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking the call.
My pleasure.
I was watching Cenk Uygur on the Young Turks last night, and he was saying that during Bernie's hospitalization, he came up with put the finishing touches to a new proposal for campaign finance reform. I was wondering if you had been alerted to that and whether you had knew about it and whether you would have any comments on it.
I have heard about it. I don't know the details of it. It has been reported in the media. I haven't had a chance to dig into it. But Bernie comes on this program with some regularity. It seems like he's on about once a month these days while he's running for president. So certainly the next time he drops by, I'll ask him about it. Okay.
Well, I was going to tie that to what Mark Pocan was saying earlier about how people are so mad at, the political types and allowing the plutocrats to take advantage of us since they assassinated JFK in '63. You have any comments along those lines? And whether that anger is going to get transferred into real political action that brings us back to. I know you keep saying that you can't have self-pity. You can't just sit back and do nothing. But
there's room for despair.
What do you think the odds are that we're ever going to get back to a reasonable
I think it's going to take a crisis, Tim, and thank you for asking the question. And in fact, I wrote a book about this called The Crash of 2016, which is now out of print, because 2016 is gone and the crash didn't happen. I would say it did happen, actually, and they've been kind of holding it back by pouring cheap money in. But the point of the book was how political cycles happen and how change happens and how crisis produces change. And sometimes that gets interrupted. We had 3 political assassinations in the 60s, between 63 and 67, Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, that did serious damage to the progressive movement of that time. And, God forbid we should go back to that kind of an era. In fact, we're going to be having Lamar Waldron on the program. Is it tomorrow, Sean? Tomorrow. Lamar is going to be here with us for an hour. Lamar and I wrote 2 books about the Kennedy assassination, Legacy of Secrecy and Ultimate Sacrifice. And Lamar has since written another book about that and another book about Watergate. I think it's called Watergate, The Hidden History. And, we need to learn from those experiences. But I think the main lesson that I've learned in the years since then is that the idea that some grand leader is going to save us, this salvationistic thinking that seems to come out of, the monotheistic religions, particularly Christianity, that some perfect divine person is going to come down from the sky and save us, whether that person is Bernie or Elizabeth Warren, or whether, for the right that person was Donald Trump, or whether it's another FDR or whatever, that we have to set that aside. That's magical thinking. That we need to be saving ourselves, that we need to be in the streets, and we need to be in the voting booths, and we need to be talking to our representatives loudly right now. Their telephone number is 202-224-3121. We need to be talking to our elected representatives and telling them that we want clean elections, we want fair and safe elections, we want honesty and political advertising, which we're not getting from Trump right now, and we need it now. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Okay, Donald Trump going totally lawless, and now you've got Lindsey Graham and Trey Gowdy, a senator, a member of the House, former member of the House. No, I think Gowdy's still a member of the House, isn't he? Yeah. You've got these guys who, when the Bill Clinton impeachment was going on, saying, the White House must present these records. You have no choice. This is the rule of law. And now they're defending Donald Trump, going, he doesn't have to give you any records. The Republican Party is so hypocritical because basically they owe their allegiance, they owe their loyalty to one source, money, mammon. They have chosen money over everything else, whether it's big corporations or billionaires. This is who the Republican Party serves, full stop. For 15, 16 years on this program, I've had a contest going. It's continuing today. I will send you an autographed copy of one of my books. And, if I've got enough copies, you can pick the one you want. There are a few that I only have 1 or 2 copies of. But in any case, I'll send you an autographed copy of one of my books if you can name one piece of legislation in the last 30 years, since Ronald Reagan became president, in the last nearly 40 years, one piece of legislation that was proposed by Republicans, passed with a majority of Republicans, signed by a Republican president, whose principal beneficiary, where the principal beneficiary of that legislation was average working Americans. If you can find one piece of legislation that was passed by Republicans that accomplishes that, I will send you a book. And I'm just telling you, you won't be able to do it. Nobody's done it in 15 years, and it's not going to happen now. This is how bad it is. And these guys are totally sold out. And now you've got an oligarch running a news organization, Rupert Murdoch, now his son Lachlan running Fox News. Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, wrote a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald titled, "Murdoch is the cancer at the heart of Australian democracy." And he talks about how Rupert Murdoch owns more than half the media in Australia. And he has flipped Australian democracy on its head and turned and helped right-wingers take over Australia politically. Then he moved to the United Kingdom, did the same thing with Maggie Thatcher and the whole right-wing revolution there in the UK, right up to Brexit. You know, and owns now the Times of London and the Sun and the Star and the Sky TV network, which is beaming right-wing stuff now into Poland and into Hungary and into other, into Turkey and into other countries where now we've got right-wing strongmen, leaders, presidents, whatever you want to call them, into the Philippines and Duterte. And then he comes to the United States and buys the New York Post and buys the Wall Street Journal and starts Fox News and is poisoning the minds of Americans. This was the assertion of the former Prime Minister of Australia. Richard Nixon didn't have that. He didn't have a right-wing billionaire owning the media. He didn't have literally thousands of radio stations owned by 3 billionaire oligarchs. He didn't have a television network, over 200 television stations owned by a billionaire oligarchic family. Donald Trump has all those things, which means that the bar is so much higher now than it was for Nixon, for example, or Bill Clinton, the impeachment, because there is this giant echo chamber, and not to mention all of these right-wing websites that are so well-funded, and now they've even got their tentacles into Facebook and Google, but in particular into Facebook now, with Facebook taking this Trump ad that literally lies about what was going on in Ukraine. CNN said, we will not broadcast that. It's a violation. There actually is a law. It was passed in 2002. There's a law that says that you can't run ads on media, political ads, that explicitly, overtly contain lies. You can't do it. And the House of Representatives passed a law that would extend that to electronic media, to things like Facebook and websites and things like that. Mitch McConnell, Moscow Mitch, will not consider even a debate of that law on the floor of the Senate. And meanwhile, Judd Legum over at popular.info, he lays out what's going on, how Facebook is just taking Trump's money and publishing his lies, and millions of people are hearing and seeing them. It's remarkable. Back with your calls after the break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
As Trump slaughters or allows Turkey to slaughter using American weapons our allies, the Kurds.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Cokeland, The Secret History of Coke Industries and Corporate Power in America by Christopher Leonard. This is from the preface. On May 18th, 1981, 4 Wall Street bankers traveled to Wichita, Kansas. They went there to make an offer to Charles Koch, the CEO of an obscure mid-size energy company. The bankers from Morgan Stanley wanted to convince Koch to take his family's company public, offering shares for sale on the New York Stock Exchange. Their deal was squarely in line with the conventional wisdom of corporate America at the time. Going public was seen as a natural progression for companies like Koch Industries, offering them access to big pools of money and promising enormous paydays for the existing team of executives. All it required from the CEO was to surrender control. Morgan Stanley, in return, would collect a small fortune in fees. Charles Koch was 45 years old. He had run Koch Industries since he was 32 when his father died suddenly. He was trim, tall, and had an athlete's build. He spoke quietly in meetings and seemed almost passive. The bankers laid out their plan to take Koch public. They revealed what, to most executives at least, might have been the most significant detail. If Charles Koch agreed to the deal, he could earn $20 million overnight. The bankers seemed incredulous when they prepared a confidential memo about Koch's reaction. He does not want this cash, the memo reported. Charles Koch calmly explained to them why their offer made no sense. His company was breathtakingly profitable. It operated in vital, deeply complex corners of the American energy industry. During the 1980s, Koch Industries was the largest purchaser and transporter of U.S. crude oil. It owned an oil refinery. It employed teams of commodity traders who bought and sold a wildly diverse menu of raw materials and financial products, from gasoline to paper futures contracts. This might have encouraged most CEOs to take their company public. Koch Industries, however, did not want outsiders to know how much money its traders were earning. Taking the company public would expose too many of its secrets. The memo said, certain of Koch's commodity traders are particularly worried that their high salaries, once disclosed to the public, would be used against them by their trading partners. Secrecy was a strategic necessity for Koch Industries. Charles Koch did not want to surrender it. He also didn't want to surrender control. He had a specific, clear vision of how to run his company, and he didn't need Wall Street investors to interfere. If the bankers expected Charles Koch to go along with the conventional wisdom of their time, then they, like so many outsiders, did not understand him. Beneath his low-key veneer, Charles Koch was, at his core, a fighter. He had unmovable ideas about how things should be, and he did not back down when challenged. When he was challenged by his own brothers for control of Koch Industries, he fought them in a bitter legal battle that lasted decades. When he was challenged by members of a powerful labor union during his first years as CEO, he fought them even as they committed an act of industrial sabotage that nearly destroyed Koch's oil refinery. When the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into Koch Industries' oil gathering business, Charles Koch fought them with every legal and political tool at his disposal. When a liberal Congress and President Barack Obama sought to impose regulations on the fossil fuel industry to control greenhouse gas emissions, Charles Koch fought them in ways that changed U.S. politics. In each of these fights, Charles Koch prevailed. When Charles Koch dismissed the bankers in 1981, it was just a small skirmish in the larger war to control Koch Industries. After prevailing in that fight, he created a company that was true to his vision. He avoided the snares that entangled many publicly traded companies that report their financial results to investors every 3 months. Koch Industries didn't have to think quarter to quarter. The company thinks year to year. An internal think tank and deal-making committee called the Development Group will sometimes think through a business deal on a timeline measured in decades. This long-term view made Koch more nimble where other companies stumbled. In 2003, for example, Koch Industries bought a group of money-losing fertilizer plants when no publicly traded company was willing to take the risk. Today, those plants are as profitable as a broken ATM machine that spews out cash around the clock. Unlike publicly traded companies, Koch Industries does not pay out rich dividends to investors. Charles Koch insists on reinvesting at least 90% of the company's profits, fueling its constant expansion. This strategy laid the foundation for decades of continuous growth. Koch Industries expanded continuously by purchasing other companies and branching out into new industries. It specialized in the kind of businesses that are indispensable to modern civilization, but which most consumers never directly encounter. The company is embedded in the hidden infrastructure of everyday life. Millions of people use Koch's products without ever seeing Koch's name attached. Koch refines and distributes fossil fuels, from gasoline to jet fuel, on which the global economy is dependent. Koch is the world's third largest producer of nitrogen fertilizer, which is the cornerstone of our modern food system. Coke makes the synthetic materials used in baby diapers, waistbands, and carpets. It makes the chemicals used for plastic bottles and pipes. It owns Georgia Pacific, which makes the wall panels, beams, and plywood required to build homes and office buildings. It makes napkins, paper towels, stationery, newspaper, and personal hygiene products. Koch Industries owns a network of commodities trading offices in Houston, Moscow, Geneva, and elsewhere, which are the circulatory system of modern finance. The book, Kochland, by Christopher Leonard. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And boy, there is so much on our plate right now. Kevin in Olympia, Washington. Hey, Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Impeachment's on my mind, and I love it in the morning.
Yeah. And a fine thing it is, yes.
Okay, here's my question. If Trump was, assuming he'll be impeached, and if he's convicted, what happens to all of his staff and the people that support him? And I guess I keep thinking about it as I've been waiting, and it's both, can they now be, subpoenaed and compelled to testify? Do they lose their immunity? And especially, what if he refused to leave the office? What would happen?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different pieces to that question, Kevin. First of all, if Trump is impeached by himself, then Mike Pence becomes president. Pence then can make the choice of whether to keep or discard any of the members of his staff. With regard to presidential immunity or the presidential privilege, basically, to the best of my knowledge, that evaporates. Although, this is something that would have to be tossed to the courts, because you actually do want the president to be able to seek advice and counsel without fear that what he says will someday be published in the New York Times. I mean, that's a legitimate concern. On the other hand, you want the president to be held to account if he commits crimes or if he's trying to conspire to commit crimes. So, there's a delicate, bridge there, or path, or whatever. We'll just see how it plays out. Peter, listening to WBAI in New York City. Hey, Peter, what's up?
How you doing, Tom?
Good. What's on your mind?
A bit nervous here. I'm going to preface what I'd like to say by quoting Chomsky, or paraphrasing what Noam Chomsky said a while back, that the Republican Party is the largest and most notorious criminal organization around.
Yeah, certainly in my lifetime. They're right up there with the mafia.
Much bigger. I think they've.
I think they are now. I don't think they were when the mob was taken. When the mob killed Jack Kennedy in 1963, I think they were larger and more powerful than the Republican Party. But I think the roles have reversed, and now we've got a mobster in the White House.
Worse, I think we have a deranged man-child Caligula and this. I can envision this, and I'm hoping that there is still hope that if push comes to shove, that he won't declare martial law based upon some sort of shock doctrine, American version of the Reichstag fire.
Right.
Because he's capable of doing anything, and if push comes to shove, if it's not martial law, will he incite violence in the streets from what's been
he's already doing
calculated.
that. I mean, look at what happened in El Paso. You had over 20 people shot to death because they were Hispanics, because Trump has been raging against Hispanics ever since he first announced his candidacy. I mean, that guy was a Trump follower. It's there already is this blood in the streets, frankly, as a consequence of this.
Do you actually believe that the 2020 election will actually be a real election that's not completely rigged on the Republican side and just to show, basically there for show?
We know that elections have been stolen by Republicans for decades now. We know that one of the most effective tools that they've been using, particularly since the late 90s, has been kicking people off the voting rolls in state after state, that this has been a multi-state effort. It's happening in about 30 states. You had Chris Kobach with Crosscheck, Interstate Crosscheck, doing this. You've got individual states doing it. We saw this in the lead up to the 2016 election, where Hillary Clinton lost these 4 states by a combined 81,000 votes. And in those states, in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, in each one of those states, over 100,000 people had been removed from the voting rolls just before the election. We saw 500,000 people removed from the voting rolls in Georgia just before the guy who did it became governor over Stacey Abrams. So no, I don't think it's going to be a free and fair election, not by a long shot, Peter. And I think that we're already seeing the Trump administration or the Trump campaign lying in ads on Facebook. I'm expecting that, and we're probably going to be soon seeing more. Seth Abramson says it's not just Russia, it's actually a coalition of Russia, some of the right-wingers in Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, that they've all basically gotten together and conspired to make Donald Trump president for their own benefit, and Turkey. And so what we've got to do is, the only way the Democrats do win elections now is, if the Republicans are going to steal 5% of the vote or suppress 5% of the vote, we have to turn out 7% of the vote, or 8%, or 10, or 12%. We've got to double and triple down. And until we've got enough power, that is, take control of the Senate and the White House, that we can pass laws that will restore good governance to the United States, to the extent that we ever had it. And
my fear is, and I'm hoping that I'm wrong, but my perception, trying to see a bigger picture historically, is that we've already slipped over the edge into fascism. It's just not called that.
I think there's about a 10% chance that you're right. The one thing that I think that could take us back is a crisis. A crisis will flip us in one of two directions, and whether it's a military crisis, whether it's World War III, or whether it's an economic crisis, a repeat of the Great Depression, or even a repeat of the crash of 2007-8 or 8-9, we have to keep in mind that in 1932, when America was electing Franklin Roosevelt, Adolf Hitler was rising to power in Germany. Both countries were badly, badly, badly hit by the Great Depression. Germany chose to...
I'm not comparing Donald Trump to Hitler, so I don't want to be misquoted on that if it ever comes up. But the situation and the circumstances are very similar, and something like a Reichstag fire, American style, or internationally promoted by Trump, would serve the Republicans and his interests.
Oh,
very,
and it
very
did
well.
on 9/11 in 2001. That was George Bush's Reichstag fire, and I wrote about this, and in fact, published a book about this called We the People. And I am very concerned about this too, Peter. Peter, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Will in Broomfield, Colorado. Hey, Will, what's up?
First of all, Tom, when are you coming back to Denver? I'm holding in my hands the last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. I've been looking for it forever. You must autograph it.
Okay, we'll have to organize a book signing in Denver. I'm totally up with that, or fine with that, or down with that, or however you say.
Getting back to my main point, we were talking about worst case scenarios, and in 1992, I was attending law school at CU Boulder, and Archibald Cox came as a visiting professor.
Whoa.
Yes, and I took both classes. They were wonderful classes. I learned a lot. But, of course, the anecdotes were the real reason I attended the classes.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cox said that when he was a special prosecutor, his greatest fear that Nixon would resist so much. The worst-case scenario was U.S. Marshals who would be delivering subpoenas and enforcing the special prosecutor's orders, getting into a gun battle with Secret Service agents at the White House. That was his worst fear.
Whoa.
And back 30 plus years ago, that's outrageous. It's preposterous.
Yeah. No, and there was speculation that Nixon wouldn't leave the White House. Ultimately, that's not what happened.
But back then it was an outrageous scenario. Now, not so much.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where, we just need to put as much support as we can behind Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats and the people who are trying to do the right thing, and the few Republicans who do come out. I mean, Justin Amash in Michigan, for example, has come out and said, Trump shouldn't just be investigated, he should be impeached. And that was based on the Mueller report. So, we need to support them, too, to the extent that, we can hold our breath or bite our tongue or whatever. But, Will, I thanks for that story. That's shocking. Amazing. Pierre in Hartselle, Colorado. Hey, Pierre, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Listen, something light. The other night we were watching a football game as Dallas Cowboys against the Green Bay Packers, and Green Bay won. And up in the boxes, the prestige boxes, were George Bush, H.W. Bush, last president, and Murdoch. And so we had the torturing, lying us into war, tanking the economy president up there, and Murdoch that is just ruining this country with propaganda. But Green Bay Packers are the team owned by their state, so I would call that socialism versus fascism.
Right.
And guess what? The socialists won.
The Packers won.
Packers won.
Okay.
Anyway, that was just on a light note. Watching socialism win out finally in this country. So
a great story.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Bye.
Good. Thanks a lot. Great to hear from you. Elizabeth in West Hollywood, California. Hey, Elizabeth, what's up?
Hi. A lot of valid complaints against Trump. And one that has not been addressed is I think he needs an evaluation for Alzheimer's. When he slurred the words United States, that's only one of many times he's done that, and that's usually an indication. And considering his father had Alzheimer's, I think he's really in line for it, or he already has the beginning of it.
Yeah, although, my mother had Alzheimer's. I know what that deterioration looks like firsthand, and I'm not so much seeing that. There have been a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, where he has suddenly started slurring words, and I've always assumed that what he's having are micro strokes, these TSIs, TIAs, transient ischemic events, or whatever. These microstrokes. But I don't know. He's not going to get evaluated, though, Elizabeth. I guarantee you it's not going to happen.
I realize that, but I think it needs to be out there because it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
Not able to.
Oh, it's particularly a serious problem when this guy's got the codes to the nuclear bombs, and when he's like we just saw what he just did with Turkey, where he said to Erdogan, "Yeah, sure, you want to go slaughter the Kurds, our allies, the guys who fought on our behalf, the guys who are holding 90,000 ISIS prisoners. Sure, go ahead, no problem." Today he's saying, "Well, we're not endorsing their slaughtering the Kurdish children." But it's going on as we speak.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. It's 47 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Russ in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Russ, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom, it's a very sad day for me, and I think for this country. As you very well know, as you just made mention of, as you and I speak right now, the brave Peshmerga Kurdish fighters who did 95% of the fighting against ISIS, according to Barry McCaffrey, 4-star general, are being slaughtered by the Turks coming in from the north, and not as well known, but the Russians are moving up from the south. They're going to put these people into a literal vice and wipe them out. Now, Trump made this possible by withdrawing our people from that part of Syria, and he did not consult with our military, did not consult with our diplomats. He consulted with the Turkish dictator, Erdogan, who probably said something like, you know, Donald, you've got these lovely towers in Istanbul. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to them. Right. I expect that's kind of how that
That's what I've been positing, the lever that Erdogan had over Trump. I mean, the news reports and the whistleblowers or the leakers inside the White House are suggesting that Erdogan simply raged at Trump and Trump cowered and backed right down. But I'd bet $50 if I was a betting man that one of the very first things Erdogan said was, nice little Trump tower you got here in Istanbul. Be a shame if anything happened to it.
Yeah. The question I have for you, though, is I'm wondering why I know you like to get calls from people who don't agree with you. Why don't you call out the Trump-loving rednecks and the Trump-loving faux Christian fundamental evangelicals, et cetera, the Trump lovers in general, to call in and defend their emperor God as he betrays these...
They're generally afraid to do it. You know, if somebody calls and says, I want to go on the air and disagree with Tom, they go to the front of the line, literally. I mean, I've been saying this for years, but they're just afraid to do it. And we've been reaching out to right-wingers who have historically come on this program to defend Donald Trump and debate me on various issues. You know, sometimes it's just a straight, clean debate about economics or something like that. But, one of the things that this show is known for is having those people on so that I can role model for people how to deal with crazy Uncle Ralph at Thanksgiving, or how to deal with the guy who is in the cubicle next to you who's been listening to Rush Limbaugh. And they won't come on the program now either. I mean, it's like everybody on the right is like they're circling the wagons, they're tightening down the bubble, they're locking it down, and they don't want any they're just not willing to engage. It's amazing.
Well, just one more comment, and I'll sign off. Yeah. This country is going to pay a terrible price for what is happening. No one is going to ally themselves with the United States in the future, knowing that we betray bravery with treachery, which is what we are doing here, what Trump is doing.
I think when Trump leaves office, if he leaves office with sufficient disgrace and we get somebody who is widely respected in the White House again, I think it's possible we can get some of our honor back and some of our respect, Russ. But I think you're absolutely right that it's been badly damaged, and that was the point that Dr. Edmund Ghareeb was making this morning in the very first hour of our program. Nobody in the world is ever going to trust America again, at least over the short term. Russ, thank you for the call, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Rose in Flemington, New Jersey, listening to WBAI. Hey, Rose, what's up?
This is the best program ever. You know, the last 3 days have been just so exciting, and I would like to make a very quick point, because while some people are duped into the idea that sports are sports, but it's all mind candy. You know, it's keep them stupid, keep them dumb. We have just had a bunch of hackers go into the top 100 machines that are used for our elections, and every one of them is hackable.
Within less than 10 minutes. That was at the DEF CON convention in Las Vegas last month.
Yeah. What I would like to suggest to your listeners, and pass it on, that we need to have something going on in our Congress where we can demand a paper ballot that we can take home. You can't buy a pack of Twinkies.
Without a receipt, right?
Without a receipt.
I don't know about the take-home part, but the paper ballot part is H.R. 1, which was passed by the United States House of Representatives and is sitting right now in Mitch McConnell's hands, and he's not. He is refusing to allow a vote on it. He's refusing to allow a debate on it in the U.S. Senate.
You are so stupid. We can't see through him, right?
Yeah, right. This is Moscow Mitch. This is what he's doing.
Yeah, Moscow Mitch is right. And what about this Chris Kobach? He should be in this slammer.
Yeah, look at what Greg Pallas is. I mean, Greg's a regular in our program,
I love Greg.
Yeah, and he is kind of single-handedly revealed, Interstate Cross-Check and Chris Kobach. And Chris, ran back to Kansas with his tail between his legs. But it's amazing stuff. Rose, I got to move along, and we've got a bunch of other callers who want to get in here. But thank you for calling. I look forward to talking to you again in the future. Thank you so much, Marie in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Marie, what's on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. We've talked a lot about things that people are doing in terms of voting security and elections and cybersecurity, but there's one aspect of elections that has not been properly discussed publicly, and that is those microaggressions that happen at the actual polls and the laws that support them and protect them. For example, at a recent runoff election, there was a sign specifically quoting sections of the sheriff's authority at a polling place. It did not reflect any indication of where it came from, didn't indicate that it was issued by the local election board or by the sheriff's office. But a reasonable person would have interpreted that as some.
Oh, there have been billboards all over Alabama, Mississippi, and I believe a few other southern states. I'm not sure if this happened in Georgia. You can reality check me. That have a picture of a cop or a badge, and the signs, quotes from the law that basically says it's illegal. If you, quote, vote illegally, end quote, you can go to prison for years. And people don't know what vote illegally means, and it just scares the hell out of people, particularly anybody who's, A, a person of color, or B, a person who's ever been in trouble with the law, and they just don't show up to vote.
Exactly. And so the way that when it happens at the polling place, it is protected by laws that are on the books, and I know in Georgia and in Tennessee, where it says you cannot do audio or video recording in a polling place, but that polling place, the threshold of it is far from any voting machine, far from any place where you could determine what someone was actually voting. So that's one of those things that we definitely need to get on top of.
Yeah, amen. And Stacey Abrams is all over this kind of stuff, by the way, Marie, who from your state, from Georgia, and has a heck of a political future. But this is one of the biggest issues that we face right now, is the actual theft of our election and our elections. And in fact, I have a book coming out about that next spring. Jeez, not to pitch a book. That's not my point. But anyway, this is a huge issue. And it's why we have to get active. Get out there, get active, tag you're it, because democracy is not a spectator sport. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.